I become the Demon King in Marvel. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 451. A Different Hand, Captain Shi's archenemy. Old Li's plain shooting routine was unremarkable. Simply aim, fire, and then the slender rockets hit the target, exploding with a bang. This is such a loss. This deal is such a loss, Old Li complained after each plane he shot down, as Lin Hao told him the ammunition was worth more than the Japanese's scrap metal. But each time, he'd quickly pick up his rocket launcher and continue shooting until he was satisfied. No matter how much the ammunition is worth, the lives of the soldiers are priceless. In the future, we will rely on these seasoned warriors to build our new nation. This was the new philosophy Lin Hao conveyed to the independent regiment and the entire army. The veterans were deeply moved, but they strictly implemented it. Everyone, from top to bottom, must quickly shift from the old mindset of 3 shots, then bayonet fight to a fight that could be resolved with long-range firepower, refusing to engage in close combat. As the saying goes, when you're desperate, use tactics, when you're rich, blow it up. Old Li's side was happily bombing, and Captain Shi had also encountered his old enemy. This was a small mountain path. A dozen kilometers southwest would lead to the division headquarters. An ordinary person would have spent a day traversing the dozens of miles of mountainous terrain, but the attacking hand of HUD ninjas were no ordinary men. They crossed mountains and hills as if they were walking on flat ground, covering the dozen kilometers in less than an hour. Jinx and Yoshioka, old man, you were quite fast last time. Captain Shi deliberately wore his worn-down uniform, fearing that his nano armor would scare off the enemy. Standing before him was a middle-aged man with sinister eyes, dressed in traditional Ten ninja garb. His pupils were narrow, like those of a snake. Well, Shi, you dare to appear before me? You're so brave. Behind him were over 50 ninjas, also dressed in tan. Upon encountering the enemy, they quickly dispersed, sprinting up the cliffs on either side like flying walls. You old fellow, you might not be very capable, but you're full of arrogance, Shi continued his pre-battle trash talk. Let's see how you escape today. He clashed his hands together, and a stream of silvery white liquid metal gushed out from the reservoirs on his wrists, instantly covering Shi's entire body, transforming him into a striking red suit of armor with a golden star emblazoned on the chest. Aside from the color, the pattern was virtually identical to Steve Rogers' uniform, the star, minus the stripes. Lin Hao had originally rejected this aesthetic, but Captain Shi insisted, so he gave in. Seeing the unprecedented iron armor, Jinx and Jigen felt uneasy. It seemed the rumors were true, these peasants had indeed obtained something truly remarkable. But as a centuries-old veteran, Jinx and Jigen naturally wouldn't be frightened by a suit of iron armor. In the cinematic universe, the hand is founded by 5 defectors from Kunlun. These individuals possess immortality through the remains of a single elder, and even if killed, their bodies can be resurrected through the power of the dragon's bones. However, the manga setting differs. The hand's origins lie centuries earlier during Japan's Warring States period, when oppressed civilians fled to the Iga and Koga regions, where they secretly cultivated their skills, perhaps influenced by Sun Tzu's The Art of War, ultimately developing ninjutsu. This setting alone exudes a strong Marvel influence, as uneducated and superficial Marvel editors arbitrarily plucked symbols from other cultures and blended them into their own creations. Over the next century, the hand's ninjas continued to study and train, becoming masters of hand-to-hand combat, swordsmanship, disguise, escape, medicine, and explosives, possessing exceptional willpower, endurance, and combat prowess. These ninjas were experts in espionage and assassination, often providing paid services to warlords or wealthy individuals. During the Japanese Warring States period in the Marvel Universe, these ninjas were active across various countries, assassinating daimyo, stirring up strife, and contributing to the chaos of Japan. In 1588, a formidable figure within the hand emerged, Kazenobu Yoshioka. With his brilliant mind and extraordinary strength, he forcibly unified the fragmented hand and expanded its reach beyond the Japanese archipelago. Taking advantage of the age of exploration, he established branches around the world, transforming the hand into an international assassin organization. As their territory expanded, the hand gained access to more secrets, gradually recruiting mutants, magicians, and other members, rapidly increasing its strength. After the Japanese invaded neighboring countries, Kazenobu Yoshioka actively mobilized his earlier branch in China. Leveraging infiltrated spies, he prioritized the elimination of several long-established paranormal organizations, enabling the Japanese to advance rapidly in the early stages of the war. In the comics' main universe, Earth 616, China's Spear Society and Hand engaged in numerous fierce battles during this period, strife lasting over a decade until the Japanese invaders prepared for war, prompting the Hand's ninjas to withdraw completely. This current universe, the universe of Whitebeard's Ancient One, is not Earth 616, nor is it the only universe to host Whitebeard's Ancient One. It was originally a humble universe, devoid of both the Spear and the ancestral Spear Society. Therefore, China's war against the Hand in this universe faces a far more difficult challenge, relying on the few remaining psychics within the country to fight tooth and nail, barely holding off the Hand's attacks. It's no secret that the government of the bald transport captain is the legitimate one, and naturally, the majority of the country's psychics, mutants, and magicians have flocked to his side, leaving only a handful of those who have joined the Northwest. Who among these psychics wouldn't want a better life? Why would they want to live in poverty and earth in the mountains, while enjoying the good life of the world? There aren't many capable transcendents in the Northwest, and Xiamen is considered one of the best. However, after several years of fighting, the Japanese noticed a bald transport captain's wavering attitude. Jing and Yoshioka also keenly sensed this and relaxed their attacks on the transcendents in the Southwest, concentrating instead on encircling those in the Northwest. This resulted in numerous casualties among Xiamen's comrades over the past 6 months, and his own life was repeatedly on the line. "Captain, the encirclement is complete," his teammates' voices echoed over the communication channel. Xiamen, without further delay, shouted, "Attack!" Instantly, explosions erupted. There was no sound of traditional gunfire. Xiamen's team members were armed with advanced laser rifles, boasting high speed, strong penetration, and a powerful explosion. What the hell? Jing and Yoshioka was shocked when he heard the noise coming from the hills on both sides. The dense explosion signaled a formidable firepower. When did these peasants acquire such power? What are you holding on to? Today is the day you die, old devil. Xiamen leaped up, shook his hands, and 2 laser knives appeared in his hands. He looked down from above and slashed towards Jing and Yoshioka. Chapter 452 Facing an Uncertain Future. Facing Xiamen's fierce, tiger-like slash, Jing and Yoshioka immediately drew his katana to meet the blow. His blade was no ordinary craft, clad in vibranium from Wakanda. Vibranium's molecular structure is stable, resistant to oxidation and corrosion. Therefore, the vibranium mined in Wakanda over the years has experienced minimal loss. Naturally, some of it is lost, becoming a precious weapon in the hands of various factions. They may not know the name of vibranium, but they can definitely tell good from bad, recognizing its preciousness. The laser and vibranium collided, producing a sharp, grinding sound. Jing and Yoshioka was stunned, Xiamen was puzzled. Neither of them had expected this outcome, and they both glanced at each other's weapons. A magical weapon is ineffective, metal that even lasers can't cut. After a moment of surprise, the two began to wrestle. As sworn enemies, the two had fought many battles before, each one a life-or-death struggle. They knew each other intimately. However, the iron armor granted Xiamen a new power. Captain Shi was already a formidable figure, and now, aided by his armor, he emerged victorious almost instantly, pinning Jing and Yoshioka's legs into the earth. Seizing this opportunity, 2 blades emanated from the armor's back, swirling and piercing Jing and Yoshioka's back. In a split second, the old Japanese soldier had no time to retreat, and the blades pierced his body, sending blood gushing out. However, just as the blades were about to pierce his chest and kill him, Jing and Yoshioka's body suddenly exploded, blood and flesh splattering everywhere. He survived, instead rapidly closing up like a maggot, reforming into humanoid form over 10 meters away. This was a move Xiamen had never seen before, but fortunately, he was experienced in combat. He instantly raised his wrist, and the nanocomposite components in his palm formed into a dark tube. Sparks flickered, and a stream of flames shot out. The blast of flames approached Jing and Yoshioka, but a ninja suddenly appeared and absorbed it into his palm. Another ninja hurled a ball of deep blue light at the old devil's feet, and a spatial wormhole suddenly appeared beneath him. Jingxin Yoshioka cast a glare of anger and wariness at his old rival. This was the first time in his years of fighting with Shi Amin that he had fled so desperately. In the past, Shi Amin's side had always suffered heavy casualties, relying on the lives of ordinary soldiers to inflict casualties on his ninja and thwart their plans. This time, under the orders of the Japanese High Command, he led dozens of elite ninja, but was completely wiped out, with only his own life escaping. The mysterious aid had dramatically transformed the two below's combat effectiveness, necessitating a fresh assessment upon return. In this short but fierce battle, Shi Amin's team was resoundingly victorious. However, the old devil's new tactics had given him a sense of crisis. Everyone, quickly clean up the battlefield and evacuate. The new weapons replaced by the entire army still need training to form combat effectiveness, but communication equipment has entered the information age overnight. Now the headquarters can directly see the dynamics of each unit and even directly contact each squad and each soldier. The fog of the battlefield has been greatly reduced and the efficiency of command has been significantly improved. Shi Amin's special team is equipped with more advanced equipment and even has a separate hovercraft. It can rush to the designated location at the fastest speed to deal with the attacks of the Japanese ninja. In less than a day, Zheojiayu has become Zheojia town. The villagers have moved from the inconvenient mountain ridge to an open area at the foot of the mountain. Countless huge machines are building a new town. Director Lin, we really cannot work. The village chief, accompanied by a group of villagers, approached Lin Hao, practically pleading, we can do all this work. We can move bricks, mix mortar, dig holes, fill in the dirt. We can't even live in such a nice house if we don't do anything. Yes, we're all strong enough. How can we just sit there and do nothing? Looking at the expectant expressions on the sullen faces, Lin Hao smiled and nodded. Okay, then I'll assign tasks. He had no choice but to revise the automated construction plan and carve out some simple tasks for the villagers. After receiving the tasks, the village chief and several village representatives happily went to organize the work, brimming with energy. Zhao Gang, standing nearby, smiled knowingly. Director Lin, I thought you. What did you think of me? Lin Hao glanced at him and laughed. You thought I was incompetent? Or that I was rigid? No, Zhao Gang chuckled. This isn't just a matter of efficiency. I ignored their ideas before, Lin Hao said frankly. Since the new town is for them, they should participate in its construction, even if it slows down the automation process. Shi Amin soon returned. This rising new town would serve as Lin Hao's base camp during his stay in the northwest. All automated machinery would spread from this center to northwestern Shanxi and northern Shanxi, rapidly constructing a road network and ultimately establishing a modern urban area. Director Lin, we're back. Shi Amin entered the room to report on the battle. We completely wiped out the Han's ninjas, but it's a shame that old devil Jingxin Yoshioka escaped. Lin Hao glanced at the battle footage recorded by the Iron Armor and suddenly realized, it seems the Hand has recruited quite a few mutants. The one who could open a wormhole with a deep blue halo clearly possessed the same ability as tax evasion ice. This generation's Flicker, the one absorbing flames, was either a fireman or possessed the ability to absorb energy. I've heard the older generation talk about the abilities of the other two mutants before, but I've never seen Jingxin Yoshioka's rebirth trick. Shi Amin frowned as he thought. It must be the ability of a dimensional demon, Lin Hao explained. Jingxin Yoshioka, by chance, gained access to a primordial demon. That demon, called the Beast, wreaked havoc on Earth in ancient times and was later driven to another dimension. This beast resembles a snake, so Jingxin Yoshioka nicknamed himself Snake Root. The snake didn't crush him, so he probably wanted someone to share the burden. Dimensional demon. Shi Amin didn't understand Director Lin's teasing. The furrows between his brows deepened, and his face was solemn. There's a dimensional demon behind the Hand. This is going to be tough. What's so difficult? Go get the coordinates of the dimension, and I'll treat you to snake soup. Lin Hao was nonchalant. It was clear that Captain Shi didn't know Director Lin's fighting skills. Since our predecessors are going to drive out the invaders themselves, I also think that you should avenge this grudge with your own hands, so let the Japanese jump around for a few more days. We don't know what will happen in this universe in the future, so we must complete the infrastructure as soon as possible and have a stable base to cope with future changes and better protect our compatriots. The main storyline is still Marvel's plot, and the matter of aid will only be mentioned a few times, just like when the domestic situation was involved in the previous plot. Chapter 453, Peace Between the Two Americas. This universe is embroiled in a world war, with shifting international dynamics gripping countless people. The dynamics between China and Japan naturally reverberate worldwide, while intelligence of aliens descending on New York is being presented to the highest echelons of various nations. The sudden arrival of two forces from this universe adds a new dimension to the ongoing war. A failed art student mobilizes spies hidden in America to gather intelligence on the aliens at all costs. Centuries of Western arrogance have led a mustache to subconsciously consider the aliens descending on New York more important, while the situation in the Far East is of little concern. This is also the shared understanding of the US, British, and French authorities. However, the aliens from the film's main universe are particularly concerned about the Far Eastern developments, and Nick Fury is particularly wary of the SYNOPSIS Lin Hao. Mr. President, our enemy isn't Germany, it's that ancient nation in the Far East. In the Oval Office of the White House, Nick Fury and Tony Stark meet with current President Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt nodded politely, then turned his gaze to Tony and asked with a smile, Mr. Stark, are you Howard's grandson? This universe also has Stark Industries. Howard Stark founded the company a few years ago, capitalizing on the fortunes of World War II to fuel its growth. Otherwise, how could the American authorities have chosen a small, unknown company to launch the Super Soldier project? Only a military-industrial complex with close ties to the military could participate in such a classified program. No, I'm his son, Tony said with an awkward smile. Even Roosevelt, known for his cunning, was taken aback for a moment before he managed a smile to cover it up. It seems Howard will have many sons in the future, he only had me. Tony's face thickened with embarrassment, and he quickly confessed, my father was 60 when I was born. You know him, he married relatively late. Then, Roosevelt said with a hint of surprise, he's quite impressive. Stark Industries had funded Roosevelt's campaign and had been a staunch supporter of the New Deal, so he had a decent personal relationship with the young man, Howard. He had originally hoped to rely on Howard for some casual conversation, but he hadn't expected him to be so impressive regarding marriage and women. Roosevelt had no choice but to move on and get straight to the point. I don't understand. That ancient country has been lagging behind for years. What qualifications does it have to be an enemy of America, because they have powerful aid from the future of China? Nick Fury interrupted. Roosevelt frowned slightly, glanced at him, then returned his gaze to Tony. Black Braised Egg was secretly furious, but helpless. In this era of America, Nick has no human rights. Roosevelt was considered well-mannered enough to even speak to him. Other high-ranking officials would have shouted at him at the mere sight of his skin color. Walking through the gate, Tony had been met with expressions of shock, surprise, and disgust. Knowing Roosevelt didn't value Nick Fury's opinion, Tony replied, Fury is right. Future China has sent some people to this time and space. I'm sure you've received intelligence from the Far East, but there are still large numbers of Japanese troops on their territory. It's useless. Tony interrupted Roosevelt. I don't know why the SYNOPSIS and its leader haven't taken action, but that man is more powerful than Ms. Carroll. If you were to act, the Japanese army, and indeed all of Japan, would vanish in an instant. He held the 6 Infinity Stones. With a simple snap of his fingers, not only would the Japanese invaders, but all of America would vanish in the blink of an eye. Even more powerful than Ms. Carroll, Roosevelt gasped. Carroll's intervention ultimately ended the chaos in New York. The consortium bosses aboard the other arcs, realizing they couldn't leave, resigned themselves to reality. With a zombie-ridden movie universe unattainable, they decided to remain in 1939. To stay, they had to negotiate with the Roosevelt administration. Consequently, the other arcs re-established contact with Nick Fury, as all their supernatural powers resided there. Military force was the foundation of a different dimension, while technology and equipment provided the capital. Nick Fury seized the opportunity to intimidate and reclaim command, only then requesting Carroll's assistance in quelling the unrest. She first flew into the helicarrier to repel the Dark Emperor, then circled New York City at light speed, dumping all the rioting refugees back into the portal. Then, she lifted all the arcs and landed them in the upstate New York suburbs. This divinely inspired move shocked New Yorkers and the soldiers who had arrived in the city. When the news reached the Roosevelt administration, it was understandable that the authorities were in disbelief. So when the helicarrier flew over Washington, Carol put on another show, allowing the Roosevelt administration to clearly see her combat prowess and laying the foundation for negotiations. Hearing Tony's words about a transcendent being even more powerful than Carol in the East, Roosevelt was stunned but also understood the thorny issue. After watching Carol's performance, the generals in the Pentagon gave a verbal assessment that, given the enemy's combat power, the existing military would find no way to defeat them, even at the cost of human lives. The American army couldn't defeat Carol, and the Japanese devil certainly couldn't defeat a transcendent even more powerful than Carol. What's your plan? Roosevelt hoped that this group of American elites from the future could help them overcome this crisis. I'll be responsible for increasing basic productivity, and Fury will be responsible for organizing the superpowers of this universe. Tony Stark was furious at Nick Fury and the other corporate bosses for their escape, but he couldn't bear to watch 1939 America be destroyed. Furthermore, with a portal already in place, the connection between the two universes couldn't be severed. How could the refugees from the main universe of the film live peacefully in the Fortress of Doom in the future? After much deliberation, Tony finally let go of his anger at Nick Fury and the corporate bosses and planned a future for the American refugees and 1939 America. Even for his own benefit, Tony didn't want his daughter Morgan to live in a world overrun by zombies, trapped in the Fortress of Doom and breathing the air of restriction. Upon hearing Tony's plan, Roosevelt immediately expressed his approval. Go ahead. I'll convince Congress to fully cooperate with your plan. Congressmen and the real masterminds had already been in secret talks with the future consortium's leaders over the past 2 days. Their single theme was to trade future technology for land and resources. The original film's original universe needed a foothold, and 1939 America needed all the advanced technology of the future. There was a basis for cooperation, and it was simply a matter of arguing over the price, but it didn't take long for a consensus to be reached. Chapter 454 The Strongest Tony, I'm guessing when this White House will collapse. The Roosevelt administration quickly signed a treaty with the American elites from another time and space, officially declaring the end of the alien invasion. As for the New Yorkers, Los Angeles residents, Chicagoans, and Detroiters who died in the chaos, well, they sacrificed their lives for the arrival of peace. The federal government will later erect a monument with the names of the fallen. What? A monument in every city? That's unnecessary. One is enough for formality. Formalism is unacceptable. The lower classes sacrifice themselves, while the upper classes reap the benefits of war. This has been the way it has been since ancient times. After Tony Stark and Nick Fury reunited, the helicarrier once again became the Avengers' mobile headquarters. Meanwhile, the crippled Captain America Steve Rogers, Captain Marvel Carol Danvers, Doctor Strange Stephen Strange, Ant-Man Scott Lang, and others returned to the helicarrier. The escape faction had come to terms with reality. As long as SHIE and Lin Hao remained, they had nowhere to escape. But they were unwilling to surrender without a fight. To counter the pressure from SHIE and Lin Hao, these American elites gathered to discuss a solution. Regardless of how to deal with SHIE, we must first prevent the zombie virus from spreading, otherwise the Eternals will blockade the solar system again. Stephen Strange had just attempted to communicate with Kamar-Taj, only to discover that a Kamar-Taj existed in this universe, but he couldn't enter. Kamar-Taj had changed its password and was ignoring him. This immediately dawned on Strange. The Kamar-Taj in this universe had most likely sided with SHIE. After all, this was the time when the Ancient One was in control of Kamar-Taj, and the Ancient One was Chinese. If the Ancient One, who was still devoted to him, was still there was no reason for him to ignore him. Possessing the Time Stone, the Ancient One could see the future and couldn't ignore himself, the future Sorcerer Supreme. Strange, having mastered the multiverse connection, had already attempted to communicate with the Sorcerer Supremas of other parallel universes, generally receiving a positive response. Without the support of Kamar-Taj, Strange must be even more cautious. The Eternals sealed off our universe because they feared the zombie virus would spread to other planets, escalating from a crisis on Earth into a universal crisis. Can you communicate with the Eternals? Carol asked Strange in surprise. It was the Eternals who contacted me, Strange replied. Since you're saying the Eternals are so powerful, why not have them destroy SHIELD directly? Ant-Man Scott Lang offered his opinion. Would that be the most direct approach? Tony Stark, from the base universe, sat on a sofa near the window, drinking. He had been staying out of the conversation, but upon hearing this, He scoffed. Idiot. Hey, don't assume you all look the same. Scott, Steve, seated at the head of the table, interrupted. We must unite now. If we continue to fight among ourselves, we might as well surrender. Although Steve had lost the serum, the Americans who had grown up listening to his stories still considered him their captain. Indeed, there was no one else among the Avengers who could take a leadership role. Strange and Carol explained. Eternal cannot participate in the conflicts between any civilization or race in the universe. He is solely responsible for maintaining cosmic order, and will not appear unless a major event threatens the entire universe. The SHIER is also from Earth. In the conflict between us and them, Eternal will not take sides. Even if one or both nations are completely annihilated, or even if the entire Earth is destroyed, he will not intervene. The two of them had heard rumors about Eternal from different sources, and had a natural bias against this supreme deity of the universe. Little did they know that Eternal was actually wary of Lin Hao. So, even Eternal can't eliminate the zombie virus. Steve was hearing this information about Eternal for the first time, so unlike Strange and Carol, he immediately grasped the key point. Strange was speechless. According to the texts left by the Sorcerer Supremas in the Kamartaj library, Eternal was omniscient and almighty, so there was no reason he couldn't deal with a simple virus. But if he could, why would he resort to the inefficient method of sealing off the solar system? Carol then recalled what Odin had told her. These viruses came from a higher dimensional consciousness, a company that created the multiverse and eternity. No. Carol's shattered heart shattered again. Regardless of all that, we must guard every portal and ensure the zombie virus doesn't spread. Carol forced herself to stop thinking. Ordinary zombies are easy. What about the Hulk and Thor, and the man who attacked Thor? Steve frowned. We can only unite the superpowers of this universe. This universe has a unique race that we don't have here, mutants. As a magician who had already communicated with other parallel universes, Strange knew some intelligence about them. The guys who stole this mothership are mutants. Every mutant has their own unique superpowers. If they could organize themselves, they would become a formidable force. Captain, a major discovery. Phil Coulson, in charge of compiling intelligence, ran over with a newspaper in hand and excitedly declared, "This news photo from Germany actually shows the Red Skull, Johann Schmidt, and Dr. Abraham Erkins. This information was from paper files provided by the Roosevelt administration at Nick Fury's request after the peace between the two Americas." Steve's eyes lit up. "Captain, you're saved." Coulson, a huge fan of Captain America, hoped more than anything that he could recover. "Finally, some good news. Are we all too optimistic?" Ant-Man Scott Lang suddenly poured cold water on him. "The portal must be something that SHIEA has made. If they can open 12, they can open 120. In fact, we have more portals than that. You don't have to worry about that." Tony, who was sitting by the window, said leisurely, "You don't know what China means to that man at this point in time. The changes he is promoting in our universe are derived from the predecessors of this era. The reason why Thanos on our side is different from you is also because of the ideas passed down by those people. He will never let the uncontrollable zombie virus endanger the predecessors he respects." Then he added, "But if he learns to control the virus, you can only wish you good luck. As the most powerful Tony Stark in the multiverse, he has the most complete understanding of that man. He has not been decadent and powerless over the years. Especially after SHIEA made public the spacecraft. He invested all his intelligence forces in China, spending a lot of time paying attention to and learning everything about this country." Shit, Scott Lang couldn't stand Tony. Seeing him acting like he was staying out of the matter, he was about to curse again. "You guy, Mr. Stark, what are you looking at?" Steve, in a good mood after seeing Hope, once again acted as a peacemaker. "Look at the White House down there." Tony smiled evilly. "I'm trying to guess when it's going to collapse. XN. Chapter 455, The Devil Who Will Self-Destruct. The sudden appearance of visitors from another time and space slightly slowed the war's progress. All nations mobilized their intelligence forces to uncover the true nature of the floating craft that descended upon America, but their efforts were fraught with loss and fruitless discovery. Those descending upon America were all elite eagles, led by the master of spies, Nick Fury. Using advanced technology and insider information, the Black Brine Egg effortlessly eliminated the mole within America. Information from the SHIE agency was even more difficult to leak. The Japanese only saw the blatant construction projects and military refits, leaving them completely in the dark about the source of the equipment and the reason for supporting the 8th Route Army. However, they soon uncovered a crucial piece of information that implicated all of the Japanese. What? A large number of military and civilians exploded in the city of Peking, inside the headquarters of the North China Front Army. The old devil Tada Shun jumped up from the tatami and roared angrily, "Who did it? How dare you provoke the Empire of Japan? All of you are dead." I don't know, the colonel who came to report said with sweat and trembling voice. They were looting and collecting Chinese people's things before the explosion. Baga, Tada Shun roared, "Damn Chinese, how dare you murder the emperor's people?" The offensive against the Northwest 2 days ago was defeated in a wave, and the Air Force and Army were annihilated. The old devil has already borne the pressure from the headquarters. Now if the overseas Chinese and soldiers encounter large-scale accidents again, his position will definitely be lost. Catch all the Chinese present and kill them all, the old Japanese roared in rage. Let the military police and the general staff do their best to trace the source of the bomb. No, Commander, they were not killed by the bomb. The colonel lying on the ground was sweating profusely. Although he knew that he would be scolded to death after he said it, he still had to bite the bullet and confess. They suddenly blew themselves up inexplicably, and exploded from the inside out. There was no corpse left, only minced meat and broken bones on the ground, no bigger than a fingernail. Baka. No way, Tada Shun shouted angrily. Do you know what you are talking about? Deceiving your superiors will be punished by military law. The colonel looked aggrieved. Sir, I didn't lie. There were many witnesses at the scene, and they can all testify for me. The two were talking when a sudden explosion came from outside the window. The sound was not loud, much smaller than the sound of a grenade, and a bit dull, like the sound of a grenade thrown into a pile of mud and exploding. That's it. That's the sound. The colonel's expression was a mixture of surprise and fear, a complex one. Get out of here, the old Japanese soldier kicked his men aside and strode onto the balcony. Panic reigned within the headquarters. Occasionally, a soldier or commander would inexplicably explode, with no clear cause. This unpredictable fear was even more terrifying. The Japanese soldiers, from top to bottom, panicked, their weapons drawn and their surroundings alert, unsure of who to fire at. Bakayaro, seeing this, Tada Shun immediately rushed out of his office and into the lobby downstairs so the soldiers could see him, their leader. Everyone, brace yourself. You are the Emperor's warriors. No enemy can defeat us. All military commanders, return to your units. Stabilize the situation. All troops, enter combat mode. Intelligence agents, immediately investigate the commonalities among the deceased. The old Japanese soldier, still quite capable, quickly and logically issued orders, calming the chaos within the headquarters. However, the explosions continued outside. Come on, let's go and see. He wanted to see why the Emperor's subjects had suddenly self-destructed. The old Japanese wasn't brave and fearless, but he was more afraid of being censured by headquarters, which would lead to the loss of his position and power. That would be more painful than death. The aide-de-camp quickly led a team of fully armed soldiers and followed their commander. They left the car and walked to the expatriate settlement. Expatriate settlements were naturally located near military bases, otherwise, how could a residence be protected? They hadn't gone far when the old Japanese, Tada Shun, came upon piles of bloody remains. Nearby, relatives of expatriates knelt and wept bitterly, while some expatriates prayed to the gods in panic. As the colonel had predicted, the bodies of those who had self-destructed were completely shattered, their flesh and bones pulverized, even their hair reduced to ash. How could this happen, Commander? Look! They're surrounding a Chinese. The colonel, still at his side, quickly pointed the old Japanese in the right direction. You mean, considering the other party's previous report? Tada Shun felt a sense of absurdity, yet eager to know the answer, he didn't try to stop the expatriates. Instead, he moved closer to observe. No, Tai-kun, no, the surrounded man was an honest farmer. He had walked over 10 miles with several bundles of firewood he had painstakingly gathered, hoping to exchange them for a few coins to buy medicine for his sick child. The Japanese were implementing the 3 alls policy, which restricted all vital supplies, making medicine impossible to find in the countryside. Little did he know that these few bundles of firewood wouldn't even be enough to buy the anti-inflammatory medication he needed. Baka, one of the expatriates, holding a katana, tried to vent his panic over the inexplicable explosion. But as soon as he uttered a Japanese curse, he followed in the footsteps of his predecessor. Bang! A living man suddenly exploded before Tada Shun's eyes. Blood and flesh splattered, leaving no trace of his body. Even the battle-hardened veteran was startled by the bizarre scene. Why? The Japanese expatriates surrounding the old man were armed, their bodies trembling like frightened birds. One of them screamed, "Go to hell!" Bang! He aimed his gun at the old man, and his body suddenly exploded. The old Japanese soldier nearby blinked again, this time grasping the key point. It seemed that if they targeted the Chinese, these subjects of the emperor would explode. Are you kidding? The old Japanese soldier trembled all over, his lips trembling. Impossible. Absolutely impossible. The subjects of the emperor are blessed by the gods. How could they be targeted just because they targeted damn China? Bang! Tada Shun was also blown into a pile of flesh. Before his soul dissipated, the old Japanese soldier finally obtained another important piece of information. It turns out that cursing is not allowed. Unfortunately, he couldn't pass on the rules he had learned with his life to the other Japanese soldiers. It exploded. His Excellency the commander exploded too. The colonel was overwhelmed. Everything exploded. Such a strange phenomenon was already scary enough, and now the commander died in front of them. They were to blame. Even if they were not inexplicably killed, they would be dealt with by military law when they returned, and no one could escape. Chapter 456. After cursing the Chinese, the old devil Hirohito also exploded. Such a bizarre and widespread phenomenon could not be concealed. Any Japanese soldier, whether in China or even the islands of Japan, who dared to harm the Chinese, even with a single insult, would instantly self-destruct, leaving no trace. In less than half a day, the Japanese suffered heavy casualties. This unpredictable explosion disregarded status, gender, or age. Any Japanese soldier who dared to insult a Chinese person would self-destruct, without fail. Furthermore, even those harboring harmful thoughts such as murder, harm, or humiliation would instantly self-destruct, with no one spared. Why is this happening? Okamura Yasuji, a veteran Japanese soldier who had just completed the Suizeo campaign and the Hunan Zhuangzi campaign, was about to return to headquarters for a promotion to general. But even headquarters was suffering heavy casualties, and his troops were suffering even more. The Japanese were stubborn and prone to extremes. Even though they knew they would self-destruct if they harmed the Chinese, they could not accept the harsh reality. Thousands of irrational Japanese soldiers and expatriates, weapons in hand, rushed towards the Chinese, staging a series of self-destructions. How could the Yamato people be blown to death for cursing at the Chinese? This is unfair. Where is Amaterasu? Why doesn't she protect the Yamato people? After realizing the truth, the Japanese soldiers launched a reckless charge against the Chinese, attempting to fight against their unfair fate, only to be killed without a burial place. Only after the fools were completely dead and the Japanese soldiers were completely terrified did they gradually regain the rationality born of fear. However, the Chinese were no fools. Initially, fear and limited thinking prevented them from reacting. As more and more Japanese soldiers blew themselves up, some of them finally realized something was wrong. What the hell are these Japanese doing? They're charging towards us with grenades, but they explode before they even reach us. It's not a grenade. Didn't you see Lao Zhang right next to us? He was unharmed except for some splattered flesh. At this close, the grenade couldn't have failed to injure him. What's going on? Are these Japanese soldiers being punished by God? The person who said this couldn't believe what he was saying, but the repeated explosions only supported his astonishing conclusion. Why don't we give it a try? That's crazy. The Japs have guns. Some hesitated out of fear, but others were driven by resoluteness by hatred. What's there to be afraid of? I want to avenge my parents. A fisherman on the Yangtze River drew a harpoon hidden under the deck and headed towards the Japanese soldiers at the harbor without hesitation. After occupying Wuhan, the Japanese invaders wantonly exploited the fishermen, plundering every resource they could. The small profits, which the army disdained, were then taken by companies run by overseas Chinese. Many later famous Japanese companies made their fortunes by exploiting resources in China, then reselling their products to Chinese who favored Japanese goods. Last month, a young man named Zhao Tizu encountered a Japanese expatriate who came to collect his goods. Unsatisfied with a low price, his parents complained, and the Japanese shopkeeper shot him dead. Go to hell, little Japs. Zhao Tizu, harpoon in hand, rushed towards the Japanese soldiers maintaining order at the harbor. For a month, He'd imagined today's scene countless times, but his family always warned him not to act rashly, saying staying alive was more important than anything else. Today, his anger was running rampant, and he refused to hold it in any longer. Baka, the Japanese soldier quickly turned, but as he raised his gun, his body exploded with a bang, shattering flesh and bone onto Zhao Tizhu's face and body. Zhao Tizhu froze for a moment before continuing to charge at the next Japanese soldier. The other soldier was clearly frightened. "Don't come over here, don't come over here," he didn't dare curse, let alone fire. So Zhao Tizhu's harpoon pierced his chest. The pain intensified the Japanese soldier's rage, and he finally lost his mind and cursed, "Baka, bang." Even severely wounded, he couldn't escape the punishment of God. "Haha, Dad and Mom, Tizhu has avenged you, asshole." The other Japanese soldiers and expatriates at the dock erupted in anger upon seeing this scene, and then they exploded. "Haha, fellow villagers, the Japs are really punished by God." Zhao Tizhu rushed into the city with a bloody harpoon in hand, as if assisted by God. He was going to kill to his heart's content today. Covered in flesh and bones, he looked like a demon from hell, specializing in devouring the lives of the Japs. Along the way, he was unstoppable, and all the Japs he encountered, whether military or civilian, either blew themselves up or died under his harpoon. Gradually, more and more compatriots followed him, and the team continued to grow. Zhao Tizhu, who was exhausted, was carried by his compatriots and continued to rush forward. "Your Excellency, Commander, the Chinese are coming." The aide-de-camp rushed into Okamura Yasuji's office in a hurry. "Who is coming? The National Army or the Communist Army?" After receiving the intelligence of the strange self-explosion, Okamura Yasuji had already expected the Chinese army to launch a counterattack, but he did not expect them to react so quickly this time. "No, neither," the aide-de-camp replied bitterly. The leader was a fisherman. "How can this be? The mighty Imperial Japanese army was defeated by a damn Chinese fisherman." Bang! The wicked old Japanese soldier blew himself up, but his explosion was different. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but instead began with his hair and flesh, gradually exploding before moving on to his bones and internal organs. Before losing consciousness, the old Japanese soldier endured an execution more painful than lynching, a form of torture. This was the special treatment afforded Class A war criminals. It exploded again. It exploded again, the aide-de-camp screamed, then froze in his tracks. "Huh? Why did I say again?" The nation rejoiced as news of the liberation of the three towns spread, and other regions followed suit. Their fervent compatriots rose up to charge the Japanese soldiers and civilians. Seeing the Japanese soldiers and civilians retreat, more and more joined in, eventually forming a torrent that drowned the Japanese soldiers. In a matter of days, the situation in China changed dramatically. The invading Japanese soldiers and civilians were nearly annihilated, leaving only a few terrified Japanese soldiers hiding and surviving. When the news reached headquarters, several veteran Japanese soldiers were furious. They had originally thought that by temporarily suppressing the actions of the Japanese soldiers and civilians, they could buy time to find a solution. However, the Japanese underestimated the Chinese people's courage and their deep hatred for them. If it weren't for the disparity in military strength caused by the industrial gap, and if it weren't for the incompetent Guojian who failed to truly unleash the potential of this nation, the Japanese would never have been able to invade. Now, with an opportunity, the Chinese people once again reminded the Japanese of the fear their suzerain had once inflicted on them. No, inside the imperial palace, upon learning of the complete annihilation of the Yamato people in China, the emperor, known as the Eternal Dynasty, cried out in pain, and in his rage, he spat out a mouthful of blood. Because of extreme anger, the old devil lost his mind, forgot the advice of his close ministers, and actually cursed, "Damn Chinese." His self-explosion process was even slower, and it took 100 times longer than that of a Class A war criminal. It could no longer be considered an explosion. First, his hair began to break little by little from the ends of his hair, and then fell off. Then, his skin gradually festered, and when it came into contact with the air, it screamed like a pig being killed. Then, the muscles fell off little by little, the bones broke little by little, and the internal organs rotted little by little. The screams alarmed the guards, and they hurriedly called a doctor. However, no matter what the doctor did, he could not stop the process, but instead made Hirohito suffer more. But no one dared to help him get rid of it. Chapter 457 American Gentleman, don't worry about it, just pretend you didn't see it. The self-destruction of the Japanese soldiers wasn't a divine punishment but a man-made one. It was simple enough. Lin Hao simply snapped his fingers. Collecting all 6 Infinity Stones establishes the rules of the universe. Thanos could wipe out half of all life with a single snap. However, these rules, applied to the population of a single nation, would have a far greater impact on Lin Hao than his previous 2 consecutive point-crunching attempts. Of course, Lin Hao had gained points this time, though not primarily, and their value would be reduced proportionally. Director Lin didn't care about that in the slightest. The main point was that this would allow his compatriots to take revenge, awaken their oppressed spirits, vent their pent-up hatred, and exorcise their inner demons. It was far more effective than simply snapping his fingers and killing every single Japanese soldier. Furthermore, this kind of large-scale, bizarre event could have a powerful deterrent effect, buying China valuable time for reconstruction. So, when the news reached across the ocean, the White House and the Pentagon's initial reaction was disbelief. Impossible. Only God could do such a thing, Secretary of War Harry H. Woodring roared in exasperation after hearing reports from the embassies in China and Japan. I'm afraid it's true, Secretary of State Cordell Hull said gravely. The United States lacks a traditional foreign ministry. Diplomatic functions are handled by the State Department, led by the Secretary of State. Intelligence transmitted by the embassies in China and Japan is gathered by the current Secretary of State, Cordell Hull. He is Roosevelt's old friend and best partner, accompanying him throughout almost his entire presidency. Cordell produced 2 large file bags and poured out the black and white photographs inside. These are images captured by the ambassadors to China and Japan in Shanghai and Tokyo. They even captured footage of the Japanese self-explosion. Faced with this overwhelming amount of evidence, these American gentlemen collapsed on the sofa in despair. Incredible, absolutely incredible. Roosevelt, behind the resolute desk, looked grave as he inquired, has Mr. Stark arrived yet? Tony Stark had become the liaison between the 2 Americas of time and space. In 1939, there was also a Howard Stark, a wealthy businessman trusted by both the White House and the Pentagon. Leveraging their father-son relationship, the America of 1939 was more willing to trust Tony. The American elites of 2023 had no choice, as their de facto leader, Nick Fury, was a black man and naturally lacked the trust of the group from 80 years ago. I've notified them, and they'll be here shortly, Roosevelt's secretary reported. A moment later, Tony arrived in a hurry. He had already installed a communications system in the Oval Office, but these older generations preferred face-to-face conversations. Friday, capable of intercepting radio waves, had already informed Tony of the events in China and the East Asian islands, but he was only momentarily surprised before understanding the intentions of the SHIE and Lin Hao. Tony thought it would be enough to call the president and explain the situation. There was no need to waste time traveling, as he still had a lot of things to do. But these older gentlemen were too scared. Tony found himself having to provide psychological counseling like a kindergarten teacher. How awful. Reluctantly, Tony entered the Oval Office, but he still showed basic courtesy. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Hello, Mr. Stark. Several people in the office stood up and shook hands. Tony Stark was born in 1970, making him 53 in 2023. He was no younger than most people in the office, but he looked younger thanks to futuristic technology. After a bland exchange of pleasantries, Roosevelt eagerly inquired, Tony, do you know what's happening in China and Japan? Yes, I just launched a few satellites. They're orbiting the Earth and capturing footage. Tony briefly explained the satellites' functions. Although he hadn't launched them yet, it would only take a few words to explain them back. It wouldn't be easy to claim he'd intercepted their radio signals and cracked their communication codes using artificial intelligence. Gentlemen valued their privacy. Upon hearing about the satellite's functions, the eyes of several Pentagon generals lit up, eager for more information. Roosevelt quickly redirected the conversation. Tony, who do you think was responsible? As a highly educated gentleman, Roosevelt naturally didn't believe this was divine retribution. It had to be man-made. Otherwise, why would divine retribution only now befall them? Why didn't the 8-Nation Alliance leave the Forbidden City when they invaded? When they built San Francisco and Los Angeles, they swindled boatloads of pigs from China, leaving the bones of countless Chinese workers buried beneath the Great Western Railway. Why wasn't there divine retribution then? SHIE, Tony answered without hesitation. How could humans possibly do this? Secretary of War Harry H. Woodring pressed. How did they achieve such precision strikes? Tony took a deep breath, pondered for a moment, and ultimately decided to tell them the truth. Although the truth was cruel, it was important for these people to have a clear understanding. Whether they were devastated or deliberately avoided it, it was a future they had to face. He pulled a small metal disc from his pocket, placed it on the coffee table, and gently pressed it. Light shot upwards, forming a projected image. At the beginning of the universe, there were 6 singularities. They transformed into 6 infinity stones, one in every parallel universe. In just a few minutes, Tony reshaped the worldview formed over decades for the gentleman in the office. As long as you gather all 6 infinity stones, you can establish new rules for the universe. For example, you could randomly wipe out half of all life, or bring back life that's been wiped out for 5 years. Facing the stunned, bewildered gazes of the others, Tony smiled wryly and said, "Yes, these are things that have happened in our universe before, so there's no doubting their authenticity." Roosevelt was silent for a long time before finally speaking. "Tony, are you saying that SHIE is using the 6 infinity stones to establish a rule for the Japanese? A rule that will cause them to self-destruct if they harbor any ill will towards the Chinese?" "Yes, SHIE possesses all 6 infinity stones," Tony replied. The temperature in the Oval Office heated up considerably. "Doesn't that mean," a general from the Pentagon trembled, "that they can establish the same rules for Americans? The Chinese can't be beaten or scolded, but can only be worshipped like ancestors? How can this even work? Did they see the emperor being manipulated to death? If that person wants to relieve his boredom in this way," Tony said with a wry smile, "yes, he can do it. It's just a snap of his fingers. Gentlemen, something's wrong." The office door was pushed open, and another secretary responsible for collecting and organizing emergency communications from various departments for the president rushed in, reporting anxiously, "Japanese immigrants in New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles and other places have exploded for unknown reasons, and Chinese immigrants are attacking communities where Japanese immigrants live. Tell the police everywhere to leave it alone." Secretary of State Cordell Hull, who was in tune with his old friend, immediately said, "As long as the Chinese don't spread the attack, just pretend you didn't see it." Chapter 458 Nick Fury's Super Soldier Plan. It was so frustrating, so frustrating. It could be said that not since the Canadian militia burned down the White House had these American gentlemen faced such a frustrating situation. They couldn't hit or scold the Chinese, and they had to worship them as their ancestors. Why? This isn't fair. Truth is only within the range of cannons, as we Westerners say. Tony Stark, who had much else on his mind, had no desire to continue their meaningless complaints. He stood up and hurled a cruel remark. "Your anger and injustice are simply because you can't accept that they, once backward, have become powerful again. Don't take it too seriously. Even according to normal history, they would still be America's greatest enemy in 70 or 80 years. How's it going? Does it make you feel better?" Tony left the Oval Office, but his voice, tinged with sarcasm, echoed in the room, lingering. After a period of struggle and adjustment, the American elites from 2023 sadly discovered that the America of this era offered them little. Despite boasting the highest approval president in history and one of the most efficient governments, stripping away the veneer revealed nothing more than a bunch of stubborn, conservative old men. If their enemies were merely the Nazis and the Japanese, or even Hydra, they would be insignificant, even if their teammates were incompetent. But their enemy was the powerful SHIE, capable of freely linking the multiverse and possessing 6 infinity stones, capable of using them without harm. Thus, the best president and most efficient government became useless, not completely useless, but merely dispensable. "You have to rely on yourself," Nick Fury said to his trusted henchman, Phil Coulson, as he gazed at the embryos growing in a culture chamber in a newly constructed factory in the northern suburbs of New York. He'd been passionately engaging with the Roosevelt administration these days, assuming the great president so beloved by countless Americans would be different from the other slutty, flirtatious women. But he'd been surprised to find himself an arrogant racist, dismissing his opinions based solely on the color of his skin. The other high-ranking officials were even worse. Though outwardly polite, they'd secretly wipe their hands on handkerchiefs after every handshake, then discarded the brand new ones. In this atmosphere, even the might of Nick Fury was powerless. He'd deeply experienced the doctor's wise words, barely missing the venom of a dagger. Coulson, standing beside him, didn't object. After all, coming from the base universe, he'd experienced countless hardships and understood the meaning better. He stared at the incubator, a hint of doubt. Can this embryo truly grow into a being as powerful as Carol? As Carol's teammate, Coulson had a deep understanding of her strength and couldn't imagine these bioweapons matching her. If it succeeds, it'll be even more powerful than Carol. Nick Fury's eyes burned. He hadn't told Coulson whose genes the embryo before him had inherited, nor even the source of the technology. But Coulson was no fool. As a brilliant agent who had worked alongside Nick Fury in the 1990s with the Skrulls, he understood that this biotechnology, which was clearly more advanced than Earth's, must have come from alien sources. Who else could Nick Fury have known besides the Skrull refugees? And the black-boiled egg of the main film universe had never come into contact with the Macru. How is the mutant search going? Nick Fury turned the conversation to another pressing task. Edgar Hoover and his FBI are hindering us. Not only has he refused to hand over the files as requested by the White House, he's even deliberately concealing them. Coulson sighed. Nick Fury longed to challenge this colleague and senior, but by the time he made his debut, he had already died of old age as FBI director. After his death, the once renowned FBI became the Federal Warning Bureau, while SHIELD rose to prominence, freely using the others' legitimate identities without reporting to them or even notifying them. Just like the East Depot under the 9,000 years old, which could completely suppress the Imperial Guard. As the saying goes, they had long been friends, yet never fought each other. Nick Fury deeply regretted this. Now that his dream had come true, his fighting spirit was aroused. Since they won't help, let's build our own intelligence network and find some powerful mutants as soon as possible. Alright, Coulson turned and left. This newly built factory on the outskirts of New York is enormous, a true industrial park, and one day it will even become an industrial city. This is where America in 1939 transforms future technology, and it's also where the American elite of 2023 utilizes the resources of this time and space. Can't these future leaders live on the Ark forever? They're accustomed to the conveniences of technology, can't they just live in a backward manner? Moreover, many elderly people rely on high-tech for survival and daily comforts. Therefore, both sides have a need for manufacturing. Classified experiments like the one Nick Fury is conducting should have been conducted in a more secluded location. However, after the previous exposure incident, he knew that as long as he remained on Earth, no matter where he was, he would be under the radar of SHIELD. Since they would all be discovered, what was the point of wasting time building a secret facility? The most urgent task was to quickly create the super soldier he desired. These so-called super soldiers were clones created using the genes of Talos' daughter, Gaia, attempting to replicate the unique characteristics of the Super Skrulls. The presence of mutants in this universe meant countless superpowers, making it a perfect environment for Super Skrulls. However, Talos, always persuasive, was adamant on his daughter's side and refused to allow her to replicate these superpowers. This was despite Gaia being in her 20s and a mature adult in 2023. Like many abusive fathers, Talos claimed to give his daughter the freedom to choose, but he never truly understood her perspective. In desperation, Nick Fury had to settle for the next best thing, draw several tubes of Gia's blood and request Talos provide advanced biotechnology so he could conduct his own research. Pim Hank and his wife volunteered to join the project, and even Tony Stark from the main film universe contributed. Because these American elites had never considered surrendering to SHIE, they worked tirelessly to strengthen their base. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 459 Steve's Rescue Operation. This was Steve Rogers' third trip to Germany. The first time, he led the Howling Commandos to destroy a Hydra stronghold in Germany. The second time, he led the Avengers to capture the god from Asgard. This time, he simply wanted to rescue his life mentor. Outside Hamburg, a skinny Roger stood in a field, gazing out at a heavily guarded manor. This was the headquarters and research institute of the Strategic Scientific Corps, the organization led by Johann Schmidt before he founded Hydra. With the war just beginning, Steve's army hadn't yet reached the size it had in 1943, and the Strategic Scientific Corps hadn't expanded. The Mausterchild leader would wait until Schmidt's research proved valuable before he would invest more. Therefore, Steve's rescue plan was simple. He would simply jump from a hovering Quinjet, equipped with 2 nanosuits. The Germans' outdated radar would be impossible to detect. After rescuing the people, he would have Dr. Abraham Erkins don the other suit, and the AI would control the flight back to high altitude. "Captain, it's confirmed." There inside, Ant-Man Scott Lang reported to Steve over the communicator. Although they had previously parted ways, Steve, still a firm believer in American freedom, acknowledged everyone's right to choose freely, and therefore didn't consider Scott's earlier betrayal of the American refugees a fundamental error. This Steve wasn't as extreme as the real captain. He remained a centrist, sympathetic to the lower classes but not unwaveringly on their side. You see, he and Ant-Man were now working together again. "Very well, find a private opportunity to speak with the doctor and reveal your identity to him." Steve, a believer in freedom, believed Dr. Erkins shouldn't make decisions for him. He needed to consult him first. If he didn't want to go to America with him, Steve would at most ask for a few vials of serum, or even just research materials. "Okay, I'll look for it." Ant-Man, though feeling that this was pretentious, respected Captain's decision. After all, he himself was a beneficiary of American freedom. Given the advanced equipment Ant-Man possessed, the outdated technology within the manor naturally couldn't detect him. After a while, Erkins finally left for his rest break. As Erkins entered his lounge, Ant-Man suddenly jumped out and covered his mouth. "Dr. Abraham Erkins, don't worry, I mean no harm." Erkins was stunned. While he was surprised by the man's appearance, this was a universe with mutants, and they had captured several mutant research subjects before, so he wasn't overly shocked. "I'm from America. I heard you're unhappy with your current work environment, so I'd like to discuss a job change. If you're interested, please don't disturb others. We can discuss the details." Feeling the strength on the man's wrist, Erkins was neither moved nor moved, so he could only nod. Ant-Man then withdrew his hand from covering his mouth. He didn't care if the man reneged, because he felt the 80-year technological gap between them and subconsciously looked down on the research institute. He pulled out a small disc, a 3D projection device made by Tony Stark. Pressing the trigger, an image appeared. "You?" Erkin's eyes lit up at the sight. "Are you the aliens who've been reported descending on New York?" "Actually, we come from a parallel universe 80 years from now." Ant-Man's face was filled with pride and reserve. "Don't time travelers who journey from the present to the past all enjoy this sense of prophetic pleasure?" "Parallel universes," Erkins frowned, bewildered. The theory of parallel universes originated with German physicist Erwin Sheridan, who first proposed it in 1957. It was later developed and refined by American physicists like Hugh Everett and Richard Feynman. Mr. Planck first proposed the quantization of energy in 1900, which is the foundation of quantum mechanics. Later scientists discovered that every time a quantum system undergoes a measurement or interaction, the universe splits into multiple parallel universes, each representing a possible outcome. Scott Lang, after all, was an electronics engineer and had personally traveled to the quantum realm many times, so he had a deep understanding of these basic concepts and casually explained them. And then, Erkins, a scientist, pressed on. Scott smiled meaningfully. "Doctor, if you were in America, I could explain it to you in detail. Believe me, the cutting-edge technology I know is just a drop in the ocean, beyond the mundane traps of money, status, and privilege. Advanced scientific concepts are more appealing to scientists." Erkins was undoubtedly tempted. 2 years later, facing Johann Schmidt's ostracism and pressure from higher-ups, he would have contacted the American authorities and moved there. Furthermore, Poland's gradual annexation meant that the Poles, instead of enjoying the treatment promised by the mustache, became exploited and oppressed second-class citizens. This made Erkins see through the Nazis' true colors, and he had recently harbored thoughts of defecting. Steve, who had been listening to their conversation through the communicator, appeared in the stereoscopic projection and spoke. "Dr. Erkins, your serum worked." Steve compared his previous and current appearances to Erkins. "I'm that successful example. Your serum once gave me immense strength and a stronger mind. I didn't become like Schmidt." Steve spoke with genuine emotion. Besides his parents and Bucky, the most important people in his life were his girlfriend, Peggy Carter, and Dr. Erkins, the man who had changed his life. Erkins understood Steve's sentiments, and more importantly, he witnessed the culmination of his life's work. For a scientist, this was sometimes more important than life itself, for it was their quest. Did it succeed? Erkins eagerly examined Steve's past images, overcome with emotion. Did it really succeed? His serum was currently only a work in progress. Schmidt argued repeatedly, attempting to offer it to the Fuhrer in exchange for his support, but Erkins refused. Later, Schmidt secretly injected himself with the serum, transforming into the Red Skull. He naturally didn't dare recommend it to the Fuhrer in such a horrible state. Furthermore, Schmidt, having experienced immense power, had grown disaffected. He no longer wanted to work for others, but to be his own boss. "Yes, you succeeded in that alternate universe," Steve said frankly. "So I hope you can succeed too." Chapter 460. The second Inhuman Prince determined to overthrow Gigi. Desperate to regain his former muscles and American hips, Steve Rogers traveled to Germany and finally persuaded Dr. Abraham Erkins to defect. "I can go with you, but my family's in Berlin," Erkins said, tempted, but he couldn't act immediately. "Don't worry, it's easy," Steve said confidently. "Just tell me where you are, and I'll send an unmanned suit to pick up your family. Once they were successful, you can proceed." This thoughtful plan completely convinced Erkins, who immediately gave Steve his home address. The distance from Hamburg to Berlin was less than 300 kilometers, and at the speed of the Quinjet, it took no time to reach the destination. During this time, to avoid arousing suspicion, Erkins took his usual rest before returning to his work area. Because mutants existed in this universe, the Nazis' Strategic Scientific Corps included not only the team led by Abraham Erkins and Johann Schmidt, responsible for researching the super soldier serum, but also a team dedicated to hunting down mutants, led by a man named Klaus Schmidt. This Klaus Schmidt is actually Sebastian Shaw, the Black Emperor. He exploits the Red Devil's teleportation abilities to operate undercover around the world, collaborating not only with the FBI in the United States, but also maintaining identities in the Nazis and the Soviet Union. "Mark, the samples this time aren't reliable enough. We need more." Klaus turned to his assistant, Mark Sims, from outside the lab's transparent display window. "You'll have to step up your workload." Mark Sims is his assistant and partner, providing him with mutant samples and, in some ways, the Black Emperor's financial backer. Therefore, Klaus treats Mark with a warm demeanor. Unfortunately, he's unaware of his assistant's true identity. The Black Emperor thinks he's in a Mission Impossible movie, but he doesn't realize Mark is actually in a Mission Impossible movie. He thinks he's keeping it a secret, but he knows his assistant is even more secretive. Mark Sims's real name is Maximus, and everyone in his family has only a given name. Maximus, Black Bolt's younger brother, is a long-lived monster from the Inhuman royal family. Discontent with his brother's birthright as heir to the Inhuman throne, he has long aspired to overthrow his brother's rule, launching numerous coups, each foiled by his brother. Over a decade ago, Maximus's coup failed, wreaking havoc on the Inhuman city of Adelan and forcing Black Bolt, the leader, to expel Fishlet Ododo. Upon arriving in the human world, Maximus remained steadfast in his quest for revenge, determined to overthrow his brother and prove himself more worthy of the Inhuman throne. He is, in short, a man of advanced age, yet possesses a childish mindset. He possesses the power of telepathy, which allows him to penetrate, paralyze, and control a person's mind, even brainwashing them or causing temporary amnesia. However, his telepathic abilities are limited in range and require intense concentration to function, a skill often associated with his unstable mental state. Maximus's abilities are significantly weaker than Professor X's, comparable to those before he was enlightened by Apocalypse, and possess significant limitations. However, the professor, still barely 10 years old, lives in seclusion, leaving the outside world completely unaware of the presence of a mutant so powerful he could control the minds of all humanity hidden within his suburban New York estate. In an era when the professor was unavailable, Maximus's limited telepathic abilities were enough to make him a world-class figure. For example, the Dark Emperor beside him, who believed he was in control, had long been privy to Maximus's psyche, even revealing his childhood peeping at a neighbor's bathing room. The Dark Emperor's experiments, in reality directed entirely by Maximus, served as a cover-up, a disposable chamber pot if problems arose. This Inhuman prince possessed not only supernatural powers but also a genius intellect and a wealth of advanced technologies beyond the human realm. The specimens in his lab were naturally not mutants, but Inhumans captured by Maximus upon his return to Adelan. This time, The second prince sought to explore biological research to further his revenge against the evil Aunazin and dethrone his throne. In the sky, the Quinjet was en route to Berlin. In the fields outside the Strategic Scientific Corps Research Institute, Steve waited. Ant-Man Scott Lang stayed by Dr. Erkins's side, so he could quickly suit up his nanosuit and ensure his safety. Erkins then led Scott to the lab in the work area and quietly instructed him. These are the results of my research. They don't allow researchers to take any materials or samples out. You'd better hide some of them secretly. This will save a lot of preparation time later. Erkins, from another time and space, had only taken a few notebooks with him when he defected to America. These were the ones American agents risked their lives to retrieve from his home. Without samples, they had to start from scratch, which meant it took 2 or 3 years for the American Super Soldier Project to be fully prepared. Erkins arrived in America in early 1940, but it wasn't until 1943 that Steve Rogers was injected with a serum. Okay, as a semi-scientific researcher, Scott naturally understood the situation. He quietly crawled over to the sample culture tank and used the equipment to extract some of the semi-finished serum. As he finished filming the footage, Black Emperor and Maximus emerged from another team's lab, trailed by 2 soldiers carrying dissected specimens. Maximus cast a surprised glance in Ant-Man's direction. His ability allowed him to sense the number of people nearby. Though he couldn't see anyone, he could clearly sense the presence of a living human consciousness. Interesting, Maximus, a traitor himself, said, unconcerned with the Nazis' losses and instead fascinated by Ant-Man. Seeing the living consciousness moving toward his lab, Maximus suddenly addressed Black Emperor, I forgot to pick up something. Go get some of it. With that, he turned and walked back to the lab. Scott Lang, a former thief, believed in the principle of a thief never leaving empty-handed, and with nothing else to do, he instinctively broke into another lab after seeing the dead body being carried out. He made a significant discovery. Oh my God, Scott yelled to Steve on the communicator. Captain, you'll never believe what I discovered. It turns out the Nazis are also studying mutants, and they've conducted multiple live experiments. Chapter 461 The Roar of the Leader. Inside the lab, glass containers held various organs soaked in formaldehyde. With Scott Lang's extensive knowledge, he could accurately distinguish whether these organs were human or animal. On his desk lay a few scribbled notes, the German word for mutant clearly written on them. Scott's device, equipped with camera, communication, and automatic translation, transmitted data to Friday's servers in real time to prevent loss. After flipping through the notes, Scott, now back to his normal size, hurried to the filing cabinet, rummaging through the files and filming them. Nick Fury's Super Soldier Project had been unanimously approved by the Avengers. Because the SWIA and Lin Hao were too powerful, the Avengers had neither the confidence nor the means to defeat them, aside from pinning their hopes on the legendary Super Skrulls. With unanimous approval, the American Elite Eagles naturally took initiative and contributed to the project. Nick Fury has been searching the world for mutants, and now there's ready-made experimental data right in front of him. How could Scott not steal it? As for the fact that this data comes from brutal vivisection, considered fruit from a poisonous tree, well, America's Elite Eagles have a flexible moral compass. As long as they don't do it themselves, they can pretend not to see it. If necessary, they can even persuade the test subjects to contribute for the future of humanity. How many of the technological achievements brought to America by Project Paperclip are fruit from a poisonous tree? Aren't they still treasured by America's gentlemen? Scott was so engrossed in taking photos that he completely failed to notice the presence of another person in the lab. Maximus was mentally normal at the moment, allowing his supernatural powers to function normally. He was silently infiltrating Scott's mind, reviewing his memories and blocking his brain from receiving the signals from his eyes, thus achieving a disguised invisibility. Scott's eyes saw Maximus, but his brain didn't receive the corresponding signal. A parallel universe, Maximus marveled upon seeing the relevant memories. How could these lowly humans break through the barriers of time and space? Maximus was a staunch inhuman supremacist, convinced that inhumans were nobler than ordinary humans, a distinct race. Lowly, incompetent humans were unworthy of sharing the same planet with inhumans. Consequently, he dedicated himself to promoting the idea of inhuman supremacy among the inhumans, believing that their kind should not confine themselves to the tiny world of Attilan, but should exterminate all humans and claim Earth for themselves. This was Maximus's consistent motive in overthrowing his brother. He couldn't stand Black Bolt's restrictions on his people, Why should the powerful Inhumans be confined to tiny Attilan while lowly humans dominate the vast Earth? But now, Maximus saw that the ordinary humans he had always despised had mastered the time travel technology that even he, the Inhumans' greatest genius, lacked. This undoubtedly stung the proud and sensitive second prince. Impossible. Why? The strange cry startled Scott, and Maximus's powers lost their effectiveness in his excitement. Who are you? Scott turned abruptly, spotting the extra figure in the lab. Steve, outside in the field, also saw the scene via video link and immediately warned, Scott, be careful. Without a word, Scott retracted into Ant-Man form. Quickly, returned to the doctor, put on his suit, and find a way to cut off the phone line. Steve, still outside, flicked the switch on his chest, and silver-white nanostructures instantly covered his entire body. Jets launched him into the air, launching a long-range attack on the strategic scientific core gate, attempting a diversionary attack. The Quinjet in the sky suddenly accelerated, hurtling towards the impending Berlin. Ant-Man inside the lab didn't engage the insane Maximus, but quickly rushed back to Dr. Erkins. After returning to his normal human form, he slapped the device containing the nanosuit against his chest. Friday, we're retreating. Scott shrank back into Ant-Man and slipped into the nanosuit ahead of him. An enraged Maximus had already stormed out of the laboratory. Upon seeing the nanosuit, which was so different from its time, he unleashed his telepathic powers without a word. Alert, alert, the AI Friday warned the suit's occupants, under psychic attack, shield activated. In the Marvel Universe, telepathic powers manifest as electromagnetic waves, so Beast was able to use technology to create an amplifier for the bald professor. Having already encountered and studied the Mind Stone, Tony Stark recognized the power of psychic forces as early as 2015's Age of Ultron, and naturally upgraded his suit. Tony, from the base universe, had been stunned by a domineering aura from Dongfang Bubei back in 2008 and had similarly developed some defenses against electromagnetic waves. However, the force Tony faced was unscientific, and their efforts were useless. Raging psychic energy rushed towards Erkins and Scott within the nanosuits. Although Friday promptly activated the shield, some of the energy still affected their brains, causing them to faint. Fortunately, the AI wasn't affected by psychic power. Friday continued to control the suits, charging relentlessly, breaking through walls and soaring into the sky. Steve, who had been causing chaos outside, saw the suits in the air and, after receiving Friday's response, unwilling to commit further murder, he also soared into the sky. Below, Maximus frantically activated his abilities, only to find that he couldn't destabilize not only the shielded suit, but also the other one. Steve's mental will was renowned for its strength. With the added power of cosmic awareness, he might even be unable to tamper with a bald professor in his prime. Even without it, his bad man's telepathy abilities couldn't destabilize him. Steve in the suit only felt a slight headache, which didn't affect his movements. The two suits flew towards Berlin, minimizing the distance they had to evacuate. Meanwhile, the Quinjet finally arrived over Erkins's residence. 3 unmanned suits flew out of the cabin and descended rapidly, crashing through the doors and windows of the villa. After locking onto Erkin's wife and 2 children, they pounced without even a moment's explanation. A moment later, the 3 armors took off again. The Nazi soldiers guarding the residential area had just hung up their phones, and could only raise their old-fashioned rifles and fire futilely into the air. Minutes later, Berlin's air defenses were triggered, but the soldiers on the anti-aircraft guns couldn't even find their targets. In this brief encounter, the 3 Germans were completely defeated by technology that was beyond their time. When the news reached the Reich Chancellor Jan Wilhelmstrasse, the mustache-wearing man was so enraged that he prematurely displayed a roaring emoji. Cowards. Good-for-nothings. You are all scum of the Reich. You have no sense of honor. The general standing beside him was deeply aggrieved. This time, the enemy wasn't Arima's Polish cavalry, but intercenters from another time and space far beyond their time. No matter how skilled their command was, it couldn't bridge the technological gap of decades. Sir, I believe we should continue to increase investment in the science core. If we lack technology, we make up for it with superpowers. Chapter 462. There is a hole outside Tokyo. War is brutal, but the Japanese, ever since their rise to power, have accumulated wealth through numerous wars that gambled on national destiny. As the exporter of war, they have rarely experienced its cruelty. Even those whose families have been torn apart dare not defy the trend, fearing being labeled non-citizens, This has led to a frenzied social atmosphere among the Japanese on the islands for years, with countless women traveling to Southeast Asia to sacrifice their bodies to fund the invasion of other countries, with no regrets. They believe their sacrifice is worth it, all for the great emperor. However, they fail to understand that it is only the common people themselves who make the sacrifice. The nobility and tycoons would not have their women prostitute themselves or their children sent to serve as cannon fodder on the battlefield. The wealth plundered from wartime went entirely into the pockets of the higher class, while the lower class of civilians were responsible for supplying military supplies and recruiting soldiers during the war, and were further exploited after defeat so that their superiors could repay war reparations to the United States. Most intriguingly, the wealth plundered from the common people was denied by the upper classes, who refused to return it to the Americans, instead continuing to collect taxes under the guise of repayment, ultimately pocketing the entire proceeds. But in the Marvel Universe, the Japanese felt the pain, a pain shared equally by everyone, from the highest to the lowest. Lin Hao deliberately prolonged the death of the old Japanese nuclear locust for a full 3 hours. His soul wasn't wasted, becoming raw material for Director Lin's experiments with ghostly instruments. After completing this small task, Lin Hao found time to visit Tokyo. By then, the entire city, and indeed the entire East Asian archipelago, was in mourning, as nearly every household had lost a member, and the deaths had continued unabated. Headquarters had delayed for several days, unwilling to disclose the fate of the troops and expatriates in China. However, the mysterious suicide bombings occurring at home, causing panic and social unrest, ultimately forced them to reveal the truth. This time, even more people died. Most of the Japanese, prone to extremes, were irrational. They were overwhelmed by the overwhelming amount of information, all of it devastating, and simply couldn't process it. Countless Japanese soldiers, upon hearing the broadcast, began to curse the Chinese and then blew themselves up. Within half an hour, reports arrived from all over the mainland, revealing widespread deaths. Angry, grief-stricken, and bewildered, the Japanese high command finally reacted. They had to stop the people from even thinking about the Chinese. Otherwise, in 2 hours, the entire island chain would be bombed to the point of extinction. There would be no Japanese empire left. So they urgently issued a new broadcast, sternly warning the people to stop even thinking about it. The Japanese were just like that. Gentle words wouldn't take them seriously, but direct, stern commands from these noble superiors would automatically lead them to obey. It was called conditioned reflex. Meanwhile, the radio station began playing a constant stream of upbeat music and rakugo plays. Combined with the spreading fear and the desire to survive, the number of Japanese self-destructions finally began to decrease. In just a few hours, the population of the Oriental Islands plummeted by 1/3, and almost all of them were young and middle-aged men, as their youthful energy and vitality made them most susceptible to overexertion. Zhen, stay in your hometown for the next while. Don't play Dongfang Bubei this time, but you must pass on the Exorcist Sword technique. Lin Hao thought for a moment and renamed the Exorcist Sword technique Hanzo Sword technique. He also modified some of the thrusting moves into slashing ones to better suit the Japanese sword. I'm so worried about the well-being of the little Japanese devils. Zhen couldn't speak, but her large eyes were full of drama as she rolled her eyes at Lin Hao. Forget the videotapes. Just transform into a snow woman, a fox woman, a ghost woman, or anything else. The key is to spread the sword technique. The few remaining Japanese men needed more power. Otherwise, how could they serve as Director Lin's tools? Zhen turned and disappeared. She had long since signed a demon contract and later learned the techniques of ghost cultivators. She was formidable, and Lin Hao had no concerns for her safety. After she left, Lin Hao continued circling over Tokyo, finally opening a blue wormhole on the hills adjacent to the Imperial Guards Division headquarters. Using the energy of the space gem, Lin Hao's current strength could guarantee the wormhole's long-term existence. Across the portal lay a mountain basin in Washington State, in northwestern America. I destroyed the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, and now I'm giving you the American Co-Prosperity Sphere. How thoughtful of me, Lin Hao grinned. You're welcome. It's my duty. The great demon king vanished with a satisfied smile. The blue wormhole, 100 meters high and 100 meters wide, was conspicuous enough that the surviving Imperial Guards Division soldiers quickly noticed the anomaly on the distant hills and quickly uploaded a message. Prime Minister, A mysterious phenomenon has occurred outside the Imperial Guards Division headquarters, Mr. Hadatoshi. There's a hole outside Tokyo, Mr. Yoshida. The large hole outside Tokyo leads to a basin. The Imperial Guards Division has dispatched soldiers to explore. Everyone was on edge, and amidst the turmoil, a large hole suddenly appeared on the outskirts of Tokyo. After the Imperial Guards Division's exploration team reported back, all the Japanese high-ranking officials fell silent. The huge hole actually led to Washington State in the northwest of the United States. One side of the wormhole is close to the hills outside Tokyo, and the other side is also attached to a mountain in Washington State. The researchers who received the news quickly set out and conducted a series of studies. Naturally, they could not find out anything, but they knew that the energy that maintains the wormhole is very strange. It's actually America. Hada Shunroku, the Minister of the Army, looked at them dimly. I heard that the number of troops in the United States is only 100,000. The Minister of the Navy, Yoshida Zengo, asked the researchers, how long can the wormhole last? If it can last for a month or two, the Navy's fleet can go to the east side of the Pacific to support the Army occupying Washington State. The staff officer at headquarters immediately dragged over the map, pointed to the topographic map of Washington State and said, there is a long and narrow coastal plain in the west of Washington State, and the Willapa Hills along the southern coast. The terrain is relatively open and there is a deep water port. The Cascade Mountains in the east serve as a natural barrier, the Okanagan Highlands in the northeast have a large amount of metal minerals, and the Blue Mountain Valley in the southeast is arable. The state has developed agriculture and forestry, no shortage of food, and a small population. The more he spoke, the brighter the Japanese's eyes became. Chapter 463 Lazy and incompetent Americans don't deserve these lands. If you don't take what heaven has given you, you will suffer the consequences. This is Amaterasu's gift to us. The gods must have seen the suffering of the Yamato people and pointed out a new path for us. At the high-level meeting, the Navy faction began to roar wildly. It's well known that during World War II, the Japanese were divided between the northward and southward factions. The Army supported a northward invasion of the Soviet Union, as this would give them a dominant position. The Navy supported a southward invasion, as the main battlefield would be at sea, giving the Navy greater resources and influence. This Navy-land conflict permeated Japan's entire military period, its roots dating back to the conflict between the Satsuma and Chushu clans during the shogunate overthrow. The Navy faction, originally dominated by the Satsuma clan, opposed expanding the Sino-China War. However, the cowardly Zyoliuzi ceded territory to the enemy, allowing the Army faction to repeatedly achieve greater gains with smaller gains. Profits for the nobility and the Jebel naturally bolstered the Army faction's confidence, while the Navy faction's advocacy of a southward invasion never materialized. Only when the Chinese battlefield became mired in chaos and the U.S. cut off oil trade did the Imperial headquarters finally agree to the Navy faction's plan to advance south, in order to secure essential oil supplies. Now, with the soldiers and expatriates in China completely annihilated, the Empire suffered heavy losses. The elite desperately needed to recover, while the civilians needed a diversion. The Army faction also understood the significance of the wormhole to the Empire. It presented a lifeline for these drowning men, leaving them with no choice. However, to prevent the Navy faction from completely depriving them of the power to speak, they offered new proposals to assert their influence. Have you ever considered who created this wormhole? What are the intentions of the person behind it? Army Minister Hada Shunroku questioned. Despite clamoring that it was a miracle from Amaterasu, none of the imperial elites present truly believed in the gods. The proud nuclear-minded generation preferred to trust the weapons in their hands. Even if the rice balls are poisonous, what difference does it make to a starving people? Navy Minister Yoshida Zengo sharply retorted. With the military strength of Washington State, and indeed the entire western United States, we only need to dispatch the Imperial Guard Division and quickly capture Olympia, the state capital, and Seattle. We can then control the Columbia River and completely capture the state. The Navy then only needs to defeat the U.S. Pacific Fleet to coordinate with the Imperial Guard Division. Even if we can't dominate the Pacific Ocean in the short term, Washington State's resources will be sufficient for the Army to hold out for a long time without fear of being isolated. The U.S. Navy is respectable, but their Army is a piece of shit. Yoshida Zengo sneered at Hada Shunroku. Is the Army of the Empire of Japan even worse than a piece of shit? Baka. The Army generals glared in anger. Prime Minister Kono Fumimaro, presiding over the meeting, quickly tried to smooth things over. The empire has reached its most critical moment. We must all work together to overcome this hardship. The imperial headquarters quickly drew up a battle plan. As Yoshida Zengo had said, they were a starving people. Even though they knew this suddenly appearing wormhole was likely a problem, they had no choice but to jump in. If the people continued to die like this daily, they would either be torn apart by the frenzied nation or the self-destructive citizens would seek death, resulting in a drastic population decline and the Japanese archipelago returning to primitive age. This time, the Imperial Guards Division was tasked with a mission. Originally stationed outside Tokyo, this division was responsible for protecting the emperor and the capital, but now they had no men available. The Guangdong Army and the China Expeditionary Army were completely annihilated. Of the 17 Type A divisions, only the 7th Asahigawa Division stationed in Hokkaido and the Imperial Guards Division survived. Even the 12th Kurume Division stationed in Taiwan was destroyed by a few daring Chinese-led attacks and subsequently exploded in succession. Even if conscription continued, training would be required. This expedition to America required a combat-ready division. While the Imperial Guards Division's combat effectiveness was limited, its equipment was top-notch, boasting a wealth of technological weaponry. Quickly receiving the order, the Imperial Guards Division assembled and set off, dashing through the wormhole and reaching the distant state of Washington. The vanguard had already established a simple defense line in the Washington Basin, and the scattered scouts had even quietly killed several cowboys. Upon the arrival of the main force, they quickly rushed towards the nearest town. A large number of engineers remained to build a permanent fortification to guard this mysterious wormhole and prevent a cutoff from retreating. As mentioned earlier, at the start of World War II, the U.S. Army numbered less than 100,000 men, and the vast majority of the 48 states lacked a military presence, relying only on sheriffs and police to maintain law and order. In 1939, Washington state was a small, sparsely populated northwestern state, far from the high-tech industrial complex it would later become, home to Boeing production lines and the headquarters of Microsoft and Amazon. How could the existing police and sheriffs in Washington state alone possibly withstand the ferocious Imperial Guard? Furthermore, to expedite the capture of Washington state, the Imperial Guard was commanded not by a royal prince but by Seishiro Itagaki, who had just resigned as Minister of War on August 30th. The prince also knew that this was not the time to claim credit. He could simply wait until the situation stabilized before reaping the rewards. Fueled by Itagaki's courage, the Imperial Guards Division swept through Olympia, the capital of Washington state, with overwhelming force. They then split up and charged towards Seattle and Portland on the Columbia River. The Imperial Guards Division encountered virtually no enemy along the way. Utilizing state highways built during the previous year's New Deal and looted vehicles, the Japanese invaders spread across Washington state at a speed faster than an armed parade and advanced southward toward Oregon. Is this the American Army? Itagaki Seishiro watched in disbelief as the sole organized regiment stationed in Portland was routed by a squadron of the Imperial Guards Division in just 5 minutes. Is this even considered an army? As the mastermind behind the rebellion and the annexation of Manchuria, Itagaki Seishiro had seen Zhang Xiaoliu's army and later participated in 2 major battles in the Central Plains. He could responsibly declare that, aside from their slightly better equipment, the fighting spirit of these American troops before him was utterly rubbish. In any other East Asian army, these rubbish soldiers would have been executed by the garrison. The old Japanese had heard of tanks driving out veterans demanding their wages before, and as a general, he naturally understood the damage to military morale. However, he hadn't expected the U.S. High Command to prioritize military development so much, and even after all these years, the impact hadn't been fully addressed. You've truly brought this upon yourself. You've become accustomed to a life of luxury, relying on your strategic territorial advantage, the old Japanese sneered. Since you're not prepared, don't blame me for being unethical. Order all troops, expedite the march and continue to capture Oregon. There are vast tracts of fertile land waiting to be conquered. The lazy and incompetent Americans don't deserve it. The original plan had limited the capture of Washington state to just Washington, but seeing the U.S. military's dismal performance, Itagaki Seishiro pushed forward. It hadn't been helped. The Imperial Guards Division suffered only single-digit casualties in the battle to capture Washington state, half of which were accidents during the rush. Anyone who becomes a commander must pursue the victory. Fortunately, there's more strategic depth in the later defensive battles. Chapter 464, The Stark Family's Inherited Arrogance. War descended upon North America so suddenly, catching them off guard. When the news reached the White House, the gentleman panicked once again. Unlike the previous aliens descending on New York incident, which ended in a false alarm, the gentleman not only suffered no losses but also received technological support far ahead of their time, a huge profit. This time, it was truly the wolf that came to be. The Japanese devils were even more ruthless than wolves. Why? Why are the Japanese in Washington state? How did they cross the Pacific? What is the Pacific Fleet doing? Did they even notice the enemy on their doorstep? This is dereliction of duty. Kimmel should be court-martialed. The panicked gentlemen struggled to accept the harsh reality, and after several minutes of impotent rants, they gradually regained their composure. Franklin Roosevelt had already picked up the phone and called Stark, but this time it was a different Stark. "Howard, I hope you can break away from the lady's arms for a while and make good friends with your future son." Howard on the other end of the phone screamed and complained loudly, "Sir, I'm only 30 years old. How can you let me accept a son in his 50s? Listen, I know he's not your son, but America needs you and his special identity now." Roosevelt's tone suddenly became cold, and he said seriously, "I already felt Mr. Stark's dissatisfaction with us during the last meeting. The White House can no longer call him as it did before." Howard Stark was obviously not a fool. He heard Roosevelt's subtext, so he immediately asked, "Sir, what happened?" The Japanese Devil's Army suddenly appeared in Washington state. Olympia fell. Seattle and Portland will certainly not be able to be defended. With the existing military strength in the West, San Francisco and Los Angeles will not be safe, Howard gasped, immediately pushing away the three bodies clinging to him and climbing up from the hotel bed, saying quickly, "I'm going to find him now. I'll be sticking with him in the future." It wasn't just his patriotism that was at stake. More importantly, it was Stark Industries' business. The president had already said so much. If he didn't step up, the Pentagon would have to remove Stark Industries from its supplier list next year. This was a national crisis. If he couldn't do it or someone else could replace him, it would be fine. At least he had an excuse to shirk responsibility. But now, he was the only one who could do this. Throwing a tantrum would be both foolish and despicable. The playboy, in his prime, drove to his son's villa immediately after leaving the hotel. In 1939, Tony Stark purchased a property in New York for the Avengers' new headquarters, located on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, encompassing the Empire State Building and its surrounding area. Indeed, Tony completely encircled the portal, using automated construction robots to build a 100-meter-high wall. He then demolished most of the tall buildings within and converted them into an airport, leaving only the Empire State Building and a nearby skyscraper for offices and residences. He also handled portals in several other cities in the same way. However, to appease the anger of the refugees from the film's main universe, Tony established new rules for them. Meeting certain conditions allowed them to migrate to the safer 1939 time frame. This time frame was not only safe but also backward. The refugees had all been exposed to time travel films and television series, and were familiar with Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in Arthur's Court. Ever since learning that the portal was on the other side of 1939, they had imagined how they would make a fortune, recruit followers to become their own boss, and reign supreme. With this carrot, most refugees stopped causing trouble. The few who still wanted to cause trouble, after some repression, gradually went into hiding, hoping to quickly obtain immigration status and become noble time travelers in the time frame of 80 years ago. Unfortunately, before the refugees' dreams could be realized, reality shifted in a direction they could not comprehend. Mr. Stark, your father, Howard, is here to visit. The AI Friday clearly lacked the human-like nature of Jarvis. Ever since the Ultron incident, Tony had deliberately limited the degree of humanity in his new AI. Jarvis was therefore special, a family member that young Tony had recreated for himself after losing his parents, a design he had invested immense emotion in. "Remember, while this person is genetically related to me, he is not my father," Tony emphasized to Friday. Even so, he still held a special relationship with him. Open the door, let him in. Roosevelt's judgment was correct. After several interactions, he could sense Tony's deep regard for his friends and family. After all, this was the old Tony who was willing to sacrifice himself for them. If someone in the White House had been in his place, even Secretary of State Cordell Hull might have been turned away after the previous unpleasant encounter. "Wow!" Howard walked in, looked around, and exclaimed in a half-surprised, half-fake compliment, Your equipment here is so advanced, what are all these things? Howard swore that if it weren't for America, he would never act like such an unworldly idiot. While he certainly hadn't seen all this advanced equipment, he was proud. Tony felt a strange sense of satisfaction when he saw his awkward expression. Although he wasn't his father and might not give birth to this universe's Tony Stark, seeing this face, remembering the times he'd always been scolded by him, compared to his current naive look, always gave Tony a strange sense of satisfaction. It was like a child who had always been looked down upon by his parents, but finally surpassed them, returned home in glory, and made his parents admit their mistakes. A simulation workbench, a humble little thing. I made it 20 years ago, Tony said with a nonchalant expression. Howard glanced at him, and his heart was filled with certainty. This guy was indeed his own. The way he boasted was like looking in the mirror. Wow, you're amazing. Howard gritted his teeth and played the clown for America. It's okay. I've been offered the Nobel Prize a few times, but I didn't have time to go. Tony remained nonchalant. Howard was silent for a moment, then forced himself to continue the joke. Really? I haven't even been nominated. Tony was so happy that the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes could no longer be suppressed. After a long period of disgusting flattery, Howard finally stated his purpose. Smart Mr. Stark, do you know why the Japanese army appeared in Washington state? Of course I know. Friday pulled up the satellite cloud map. Tony already knew his purpose. Chapter 465 Steve's second time. Howard Stark once again witnessed the advancements of future technology. The satellites beamed back not only high-definition color photos but also continuous video, like an extra eye in the sky. The concept of artificial satellites had been around as early as 1870, but the first wasn't built until 1957, by the Soviet Union. Even in the Marvel Universe, in 1939, Earth's native peoples hadn't even mastered rocket technology. Amazing, Howard wasn't acting this time, but rather expressing the excitement and emotion of an engineer and scientist looking at the future. As you can see, this wormhole appeared suddenly, Tony Stark explained. Judging from its color and appearance, it must have been opened by the energy of the Space Stone. Space Stone, this undoubtedly touched upon Howard's knowledge gap. It's the Tesseract, a treasure owned by Odin in Norse mythology. It's actually one of the 6 Infinity Stones, dropped to Earth by aliens from Asgard over 4,000 years ago. Tony provided Howard with some additional information, undoubtedly shaking his perspective. What? Are all the gods in mythology aliens? Not all, but most of them are? With the help of Carol Danvers and Stephen Strange, Tony gained a better understanding of alien civilizations and the gods on Earth. Oh my God, Howard was incredulous. God is an alien? What about Christianity? An alien cultural invasion? Tony was silent, not knowing how to respond. He had to change the subject. Did you come here today to hear me introduce aliens? Well, although I'd like to know, the people of the West are being persecuted by invaders right now. Howard knew the seriousness of the matter. So? What do you, on behalf of the White House, want us to do? Tony studied him calmly, a smile on his face. Don't forget, we're just partners with you, but you're Americans, too, aren't you? Howard's eyes rolled, deftly framing the question. The army back home needs time to reorganize, but the enemy is already wreaking havoc on our land. Haha, 20 years after World War I, you didn't even bother rebuilding your army, and now the enemy's coming and you're raising one again. Even Tony Stark, an American capitalist, could agree with the outlandish actions of his American colleagues in the 1920s and 1930s. He could understand their erratic behavior from a capitalist perspective, but as an arms dealer, he simply couldn't accept such outdated ideas. For 2 decades after the war, America's military strength had been continuously reduced. To save money, the capitalists had reduced the number of troops stationed at home to an appalling level. If it weren't for the Navy's continued defense of the seaport, they might have even had to scrap their warships, just like the Great Qing Empire decades later. Maintaining an army costs a lot of money, Howard said with an awkward smile. Actually, I definitely want as many troops as possible. We can help. Tony thought about it and finally agreed. After all, Steve Rogers, another pillar of the Avengers, would certainly not sit idly by and watch the Japanese invaders wreak havoc on America. But this is a business deal. Howard was stunned for a moment, then nodded quickly. I understand. The White House and the Pentagon won't refuse this deal. As smart as he was, he had already sensed his future son's attitude. These Americans from the future wouldn't help this time and space without reason. and certainly wouldn't ask for anything. Tony had originally sincerely wanted to help the 1939 time and space, but after a few interactions with a gentleman in the White House, he realized they were taking advantage of him. This made Tony very upset and also eroded his good impression of the excellent predecessors of this era. Once the filter was removed, Tony saw only the naked business. Go back and tell them I'll first send out drones and armor to stabilize the Columbia River. I hope they can quickly expand the California military to fill the gap. Tony didn't rush to lead the Avengers into battle. He knew he couldn't convince anyone other than Steve, as the Avengers were still under immense pressure from SHIE. The sudden appearance of the wormhole in Washington state was undoubtedly SHIE's work. If SHIE really wanted to attack, what difference would it make if he stayed in New York or went to Washington state? After sending Howard away, Tony tried to contact Steve, but the call went unanswered. Is Dr. Erkins's potion ready? To increase efficiency and demonstrate sincere cooperation, all projects currently being undertaken by the American elite from 2023 are being coordinated by the Artificial Intelligence Friday, even Nick Fury's Super Soldier project. That's why Tony asked Friday for progress. We've run 3 experiments, and the final product's data matches Dr. Erkins's 1943 records. That's why Captain Rogers suggested injecting him directly with the serum half an hour ago. After hearing Friday's response, Tony frowned slightly. Steve's too impatient. While he understood Steve's urgency, why would a drug trial be conducted in just 3 attempts? Having Friday launch drones and the Iron Man suit toward the Western Front, Tony headed to Steve's underground lab. As the Avengers headquarters in 1939, the facility was powered entirely by the arc reactor, so Steve's second injection wouldn't require the electricity of half Manhattan. When Tony entered the lab, the skinny Steve had already slumped into the metal chamber for the second time. This time, the equipment was clearly more advanced and sci-fi inspired than the previous one. Hey, Friday, stay alert and eliminate all potential safety hazards. These were Steve's last words after he entered the chamber, clearly haunted by the trauma of his previous experience. Rest assured, security is at maximum. When Tony arrived, the chamber was already closed, and the injection had already begun. Seeing this, Tony could only shake his head and pray for his friend inwardly. Although the pain caused by the cells being torn apart this time was the same as last time, Steve's screams were much quieter, and the advanced equipment did not show the overvoltage phenomenon of arc flashing last time. The experimental process was very peaceful, and Tony's heart was relieved. When the metal cabin opened, Steve with his upper body naked reappeared in front of Erkins and Tony, which shocked the two. Shit, Tony cursed and quickly ran down the glass walkway. Dr. Abraham Erkins, who was standing in front of the metal cabin, stared at Steve in front of him, and murmured unconsciously, "How could this happen?" If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 466. Why is it Captain Blackskull? Steve Rogers, once short and skinny, had regained his towering stature. Because he was skinless. Standing before Abraham Erkins was a humanoid skeleton, its frame covered in a layer of shrunken muscle. While not muscular, it possessed immense resilience, capable of delivering immense power. Remarkably, neither the skeleton nor the muscles were red, but black, a darker black than oil. Only the whites of his eyes remained a shred of white. Steve emerged from the metal cabin, glancing down at his blackened hands. A realization struck him. Numbly, like a living dead, he approached a mirror. Gazing at the blackened frame, Steve froze. He tried to force a wry smile, but found no skin to support him. Tony Stark, already sprinting down from the glass platform, tried to comfort him, moving his lips several times, but no words came to his lips. "No, it can't be," Erkins muttered, unable to accept the results before him. It shouldn't be like this. It wasn't just a frustration of a failed experiment and the waste of his life's work, but also an unspeakable fear. These Americans had brought him all the way here just for the super soldier serum. Now he was in this state. Forget asking for better treatment. What if they got angry and killed him and his family? Thinking of this, Erkins's mind cleared a little, and he muttered quietly, "Didn't you say you'd injected it before and it worked?" As the inventor, Erkins was well aware of the serum's side effects. Although Johann Schmidt in 1939 hadn't yet shared the specific consequences with Erkins through personal experience, he gradually understood the serum's side effects after comparing it with the future information Steve had shared with him and the experimental data. His serum not only strengthens the body, but also the mind. As good becomes better, evil becomes more evil. So the black skull before him was clearly a demon. And what about the once universally admired Captain America, now like this? If all Americans admired a man who was wicked to the core, what would become of America? What? You say he wasn't wicked? The facts were stark. People could deceive others, even themselves through hypnosis, but they could never allow their bodies to deceive objective laws. Birth, aging, sickness, and death were laws. Genetic inheritance was a law. The good grew better, the wicked grew wickeder, too. Erkins was filled with disdain. He couldn't be blamed for the serum's failure to work as expected. It was clearly Steve Rogers' inner evil, his dark side. Feelings of injustice and grievance washed over him, briefly overpowering his fear. But once Erkins reasoned, his fear returned. If this man was a complete villain, wasn't he doomed? Dr. Abraham Erkins hadn't spent more than 6 months with Steve Rogers, and he hadn't seen any bright side in him. Because Steve was so anxious, Erkins immediately got to work perfecting the half-finished serum after being brought back to New York. Naturally, he hadn't had the chance to see Steve's true potential. Even Steve's courtesy towards him in the past few days was now seen by Erkins as a hypocritical facade of ambition. Actions speak louder than words. Frightened and aggrieved, Erkins trembled. Steve, looking at himself in the mirror, ignored his complex thoughts. After a moment of silence, he finally collapsed to the ground. Steve, Tony finally found the opportunity to speak. An automated medical robot quickly floated over, lifting Steve, clad in a black skeleton, and transporting him to the medical bay. An examination revealed that he was in remarkably good health. Aside from the lack of fur, there was nothing wrong with him. Well, without skin, his American hips appeared shrunken and lacking in elasticity, yet still very strong. News spread quickly, and the Avengers were shaken by the catastrophic loss of Steve, the leader of the Avengers. Strange, Nick Fury, Scott, Sam Wilson, Bucky, and the rest of the group were all present. Even Pim Henke and his daughter were there. Aside from the casualties of Barton and Rhodes, and the zombie-like Bruce and Thor, all the Avengers from the main film universe, including those who had survived Thanos' attacks and those brought back by Lin Hao, arrived. As for the Guardians of the Galaxy, they had fled to a universe of this era. Star-Lord and the Destroyer were unwilling to be drawn into such an obviously unusual crisis for the sake of Earthlings. Although Rocket Raccoon had developed some affection for Earthlings, even Groot felt that Earth was dangerous, facing the constant threat of being sealed off for eternity, so he had no choice but to go along with the crowd. If Earthlings were time travelers, then so were these aliens. With his knowledge of the interstellar landscape 80 years into the future, Star-Lord believed they could thrive in this universe. In the medical room, not only were the Avengers from the main film universe present, but also Carol, Coulson, and a young Tony Stark from the base universe. Everyone stared at the black skull in the glass case, momentarily struggling to accept the situation. Why Black Skull? Finally, his old friend Bucky spoke up, filled with resentment. Even if we failed, it should have been Red Skull. It sounded more like an incompetent complaint, but it broke the deadlock of silence. Was Red Skull like Cap back then? Sam Wilson, finally remembered by the author, asked. Their knowledge of history came entirely from books. Unlike Bucky, who had personally seen Red Skull. The Red Skull I saw always wore camouflage, and wore long shirts and long pants no matter how hot the weather was, Bucky said, confirming that his friend's current state was just like Red Skull's. But why black? Bucky couldn't figure it out, and neither could the others. How could someone dressed in a rich black lead the Avengers? Who would believe the Avengers were a just organization if they saw Black Skull? At least a touch of red would tie it back to the Stars and Stripes, right? They were puzzled, but Tony, from the base universe, suddenly had an idea and ran to the microphone to ask Steve, who was withdrawing in the medical room. What was going through your mind during the experiment? Fuck, Ant-Man, who had always disliked him, saw his chance and jumped out, angrily scolding, Captain's already like this, and you still want to mock him? Tony scorned him like an idiot and continued, according to the principle of the serum, the good become better, and the evil become evil. So your mental will during the experiment may be the cause of this situation. Hearing this, Sam and Bucky hurriedly grabbed Scott, who also slowed down his pace. Hearing these words, Steve, who had been withdrawn, finally raised his head. Everyone on the other side of the glass window shuddered. Hope Dine, Pim Hank's daughter, even quietly took a step back, only to come to her senses and quickly step back. This black skull did look a bit scary. Based on my first experience, my mind was only thinking about regaining my strength and protecting all my fellow Americans. Think about it again. During the first experiment, were you trying to protect America as a country, or the American people? Tony interrupted him immediately. The pupils of Tony in the main movie universe constricted, as if realizing the truth. But deep down, he didn't want to believe it, didn't dare. No, it's impossible. Steve, in the medical room, was stunned by this question. Is there any difference? Hey, Tony, from the base universe, sneered. His laughter suddenly grew louder, turning into a barrage of laughter. Ha 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 ha, fuck, stop laughing, Scott shouted. You've been through so much, you've seen the upper echelons betray the common people so many times, and you still think America and its people are the same. Tony's question was like thunder, piercing the fog. The first time, you must have wanted to join the army and serve your country, to defend America, so you succeeded. This time, you're thinking about protecting the people. Ha 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 ha. Tony's expression grew incredibly sad as he laughed. He turned to Carol. Carol understood, and her whole body began to tremble. Odin's words echoed in her ears again. His heart collapsed again. It seems you've remembered it again. What the man from SHIE told you now seems to be true. We have been living under the influence of a higher dimensional consciousness. What's the connection? Scott was puzzled. Sam and Bucky didn't understand either. The other Tony and Strange had already understood, and their expressions were very ugly. Honest Man Coulson smiled helplessly, and Nick Fury had a blank expression, perfectly disguising the change in expression. He succeeded the first time because his idea of protecting the United States was recognized by the cosmic consciousness, so he became the one and only Captain America. Tony pointed at Steve in the medical room and explained loudly. He's become like this now because he changed his mind and tried to protect all of America. But you've seen reality and made your own choices. The positions of the upper echelons and the lower classes conflict, but the cosmic consciousness still represents the position of the American elite. Because the higher dimensional beings that created our universe inevitably side with the elite. No company can survive by defying the mainstream values promoted by the authorities. Tony turned to Steve with a sad, self-deprecating look. You'll fail because you've been abandoned by the cosmic consciousness. Bullshit. This time, even Bucky couldn't sit still, jumping out and angrily scolding. Even if Steve fails, he should turn red like the Red Skull. How can he be black? This was still an incompetent complaint, opposing for the sake of opposing. Haha, in America, isn't red black? Tony sneered. His ideas lean towards red, so he's labeled black. With this sentence, all the eagle were silenced. Chapter 467. The situation is changing rapidly and everyone is anxious. Killing, and then destroying the heart. This time, the consciousness of the Marvel Universe has finally shed its fig leaf, revealing itself nakedly to the elite eagles. The explanation is logical and reasonable, but Scott, Sam, Bucky, and others refuse to believe it. They dare not believe it. To believe it would mean admitting they are living under the control of a higher dimensional consciousness, making their lives a joke. Impossible, you're kidding. This is clearly the work of SHIE, that's right, they have 6 Infinity Stones, and they've tampered with the rules. Steve must have been set upon by the evil SHIE. Steve, don't be discouraged. Bucky, a good friend, reassured Steve. We will definitely find a way to restore you. By the way, the Infinity Stones. Once we gather all 6 Infinity Stones again, we will definitely restore Steve. The room suddenly fell silent, no one responding to Bucky's words. The time machine had been disabled by SHIE, meaning they could only collect the Infinity Stones in this universe. The other 4 were easy enough, following the map would only be a bit more troublesome. But the Soul Stone would require a sacrifice. Even if Bucky was willing to sacrifice for his best friend, the final Time Stone was in the hands of the Ancient One. This universe's Ancient One was a member of SHIELD. If they had the ability to seize SHIELD's possessions, would they have ended up like this? This path was doomed to fail. Why don't you just say it? Bucky, Steve, from the medical room, stopped him. He glanced around at everyone and said solemnly, no matter what I become, I will always be Steve Rogers. These words sounded more like a promise and a guarantee. After all, with his current appearance, Bucky, Sam, and Tony were the only ones willing to continue to trust him without reservation, but the other teammates with lesser ties were bound to have concerns. Who knows if you're being targeted by the cosmic consciousness because you've turned to the red, or if you've already fallen into depravity. You can't judge a person by their appearance, but you can judge their heart. Nick Fury, expressionless as ever, didn't rush in to comfort Steve like the others did. He knew that as a veteran, Steve needed nothing more than comfort right now. Seeing him turn and leave, Phil Coulson hurried to follow. "Boss, do we still need to move forward with the operation against the FBI?" As Black Egg's confidant and a skilled agent, Coulson clearly understood the changing situation. "I'm saying, we might not have that much time these days. What do you have in mind?" Nick Fury was an extreme pragmatist and unconcerned with appearances. While he had previously harbored a desire to confront J. Edgar Hoover, the situation had shifted so rapidly in recent days that he didn't need to compromise the larger picture for a petty motive. "I think we could openly recruit mutants. We have technology 80 years ahead of our time, and we command vast resources. We could definitely offer a high price to lure them over. People of this era don't know SHIELD's ways. We can be the good guys again." Coulson looked up, catching sight of the sharp glare from a single eye, and quickly corrected himself, emphasizing, "We're partners in justice. I've looked up the information, and it seems the nations of this universe don't know much about mutants. They don't even realize they're distinct species, in truth. They knew nothing about mutants before. After all, there were no mutants in the main movie universe." However, Stephen Strange had explored the multiverse, and the Sorcerer Supremas of other universes had shared some common knowledge with him. That would be very advantageous for us. I'm sure many suddenly awakened mutants would be eager to know why they're different, and we can provide them with the answer. After hearing this, Nick Fury's eyes lit up, convincing himself that this was indeed his chosen top henchman, a man of considerable ability. "Just as you wish. Start with propaganda within the United States, then expand to other countries. Time waits for no one. The Avengers can no longer be counted on, so he must accelerate the super soldier program." The elite Eagles in New York encountered a sudden setback. Itagaki Shiro, who had been rapidly capturing Washington state and pushing the front south to the Columbia River, also encountered difficulties. "Sir, the enemy's sudden reinforcement of aircraft and tin men is formidable," the wing commander reported with a bitter face, still filled with lingering fear. "Our aircraft can't even get close. The weapons in our hands are completely ineffective against these machines. Our plan has been disrupted." Tony Stark had Friday dispatched drones and Iron Man armor arriving in the western battlefield, immediately disrupting the Imperial Guards Division's southern advance with overwhelming force. Even the troops that had already entered Portland were eliminated or driven back by the pervasive drones, forcing the remaining troops to retreat north of the Columbia River. The Japanese invaders attempted to engage in urban combat, but drones and armored vehicles were utterly unafraid of urban combat. Once locked on target, a single, airborne bullet could precisely dispatch the enemy. Furthermore, Friday collected photographs and profiles of all former Japanese generals and decapitated those commanding officers. Even Itagaki Shiro, stationed at the headquarters, was bombarded by several incoming armored vehicles. Had it not been for the numerous guards who risked their lives to save him, the old Japanese would have met their heavenly locust majesty. "Send a message to the forward base, have them inform headquarters that we need the power of the ninja." Having narrowly escaped death, Itagaki Shiro had witnessed the power of the armored vehicles and drones. These cutting-edge weapons were undoubtedly alien technology, and ordinary soldiers like him could not defeat them alone. They needed the help of a supernatural power. As mentioned before, the Hand had already been collaborating with daimyo across the Oriental Islands for centuries. After the fall of the shogunate, Kazenobu Yoshioka began collaborating with the Meiji government. For centuries, the group had been entangled with the nobility and chaebols of the islands. Faced with something like this, Kazenobu Yoshioka had to go, even if he was reluctant, especially since he was more than happy to invade American territory. When the wormhole appeared outside Tokyo, Kazenobu Yoshioka had already received the news and pre-selected a group of elite personnel. He had originally planned to leverage his connections to get a ride on the military's express train, but before he could even make a move, the military called him requesting assistance. "Excellent, let's go." The difference between proactively approaching and being begged for help was clear, and the power of the conversation was certainly different. Kajinobu Yoshioka had lost many skilled fighters in his previous battle with Shi Amin, but with the wealth accumulated by the hand over the centuries, these losses weren't enough to cause significant damage. Now presented with an opportunity to continue generating revenue, this old devil certainly wasn't going to let it go. Chapter 468, The War in the American West. September 1939 had barely ended in this universe, and the world situation had unfolded like a kaleidoscopic cosmos, dazzling and overwhelming Earthlings. First, Xian Abo was pinned to the ground and brutally beaten by Sandizi, then America was invaded by a group of Americans from another time and space, and then the Japanese devils were struck by a mysterious explosion disease, just as the world was expecting the Japanese devils to blow themselves up so they could flee to take in Japanese women. They suddenly appeared in the distant North American continent and, with unmatched force, swept through cities and easily occupied Washington state in northwestern America. This state, named after a founding president, became the first territory in American history to be occupied by a foreign enemy. The news spread, and the world was in uproar. Unlike the rest of the world, curious about how the Japanese devils had quietly invaded America across the vast Pacific, Americans found it difficult to accept the fact of being invaded overnight. So they resorted to their traditional art, taking to the streets. When the government raised taxes, they took to the streets to criticize the government. When terrorist attacks occurred, they took to the streets to criticize the government. Even when other countries achieve achievements surpassing those of the United States, Americans still take to the streets to criticize their governments. Even when faced with issues like poor community sanitation, excessive homework for children, or a Hollywood star coming out, Americans take to the streets to criticize the government for anything. Never mind whether the issue can be resolved, just ask if it's freedom enough. Whether the issue can be resolved isn't important, what matters is the experience. Simply taking to the streets and howling lets out a few words is enough to let out the anger. Roosevelt is incompetent and a humiliation to the nation. Down with Roosevelt. Roosevelt out of office. That idiot cripple's only good at talking. His speeches can't save America. We need a more pragmatic president. At that moment, Americans forgot the grandeur of the blue skies of the election 3 years prior, and their fervent embrace of Franklin Roosevelt, eager to heap all the praise on the president to put food on the table again. Of course, the slogans reveal that the unnamed Hoover fanned the flames of this turmoil, eager to launch an impeachment trial against Roosevelt. The situation looked unfavorable for Roosevelt, but American politicians knew that the constitutional right to protest was merely a contrivance for the public to vent their anger. It was practically useless. Even if you screamed at the top of your lungs for half a year, the state government might not be able to fix your community sewers. Instead, families would pool their money and hire a construction company. The American government was only particularly active when it came to collecting taxes, resulting in unprecedented administrative efficiency. So, in the White House, Roosevelt paid no heed to the public's anger. They could rail against him now, but once they defeated the Japanese, they would immediately change their tune and continue to flatter him. The reorganization of the army must be accelerated. Washington state has been lost, Ohio must be held, and California must not be lost. Rest assured, sir. The future Mr. Stark has already unleashed his advanced weaponry to deal a decisive blow to the Japanese, killing several enemy commanders and forcing the invaders back to the north bank of the Columbia River. A major general at the Pentagon reported to Roosevelt on the latest battle situation. When the news reached the Pentagon, the generals were deeply moved. This was their first true witness to the crushing power of future technology over contemporary armies. While the American refugees who invaded the previous time had inflicted considerable casualties on the New York police, their paper tiger nature was immediately revealed upon the arrival of their regular troops. This had greatly relieved the gentlemen, who believed their own armies were capable of fighting against future forces. However, the widespread deployment of drones and steel armor on modern battlefields had produced results that sent a chill down their spines. Too fast. Too easy. The fact that the Japanese had captured Washington state in such a short time demonstrated their considerable military strength, given that the Washington state conglomerates had retained a considerable force. Combined with previous observations of Chinese and Japanese armor by military observers stationed in China, the American gentlemen had already recognized the Japanese's combat prowess. It was fair to say that their army was indeed capable of crushing their own current army. Yet, even this army was helpless against the high-tech weapons of the future and was steadily outmatched. If the American military had been in the picture, the consequences would be self-evident. Don't dwell on it. Since we're already cooperating with them, and we have a blood and genetic bond, don't harbor any more ulterior motives, Roosevelt warned. I made that mistake once before with Mr. Stark. Don't make that mistake again, the gentleman stood in order. Gentlemen, the battle has begun again. The Pentagon's telephone line was connected directly to the Oval Office, ensuring Roosevelt was upfront with the latest developments in the West. After years of development, America's homeland naturally had comprehensive communications infrastructure like wireless telegraphs and landlines. Any conflict on the mainland could be quickly transmitted to Washington, D.C., the heart of the federal government. Furthermore, drones and Iron Man armor both had built-in cameras and communication capabilities, and Tony Stark had left a set of receiving and projection equipment for the White House and the Pentagon. The battle situation on the Columbia River front could be transmitted to the White House and the Pentagon immediately, and even broadcast live, allowing the gentlemen to witness the action firsthand. The Japanese have dispatched a special group of soldiers with superpowers. Let's rewind a few minutes. Jingzhen Yoshioka, prepared in advance, led over 100 elite ninjas through a wormhole and arrived at a forward base, which was under construction. Where are the battlefield coordinates? Give me photos of the surrounding area. Jingzhen Yoshioka approached the liaison officer and asked for detailed information about the front line. The mutant Blink needs to have a clear mental image of the destination before activating his ability to open a wormhole. The distance a wormhole can connect is also limited by the level of development of his abilities. Mutants' abilities develop over a period of time. Just like the difference between Iron King and Magneto, or Professor X with hair and without hair, they're so vastly different that they seem like two different creatures. Having dealt with Jingzhen Yoshioka numerous times, the Japanese military naturally understood his patterns and had already prepared battlefield location information. After memorizing the information, Blink immediately released a ball of blue energy, opening a wormhole to the front line. Over 100 ninjas leaped through at top speed. The destination was a forested area on the north bank of the Columbia River. Itagaki Shiro ordered his engineers to dig numerous tunnels in the dense forest and hid his headquarters in these tunnels. However, he himself fled back to the city, remotely controlling the frontline headquarters by telephone. The old Japanese soldier, having survived the ordeal, was terrified. Jingzhen Yoshioka, not seeing the former Minister of War, knew he was likely hiding somewhere safe. He sneered and led his men out of the dense forest, attacking the hovering drones and armored armor. The old Japanese soldier leaped up, wielding his katana. The blade flashed like lightning, easily slicing through the drones. Friday's control was only passable, and he couldn't match the speed of a master. Other mutants and ninjas with some magical skills also made some gains. For a moment, the drone debris rained down. Seeing the ninjas destroying the enemy who had left them bewildered, the Japanese soldiers cheered enthusiastically. Ninja-sama is awesome. Chapter 469, Japanese soldiers galloping across American soil. The combination of drones, armor, and artificial intelligence would undoubtedly crush the armies of the early years of World War II. This was a chasm created by a technological gap that could not be bridged by the efforts of ordinary soldiers. However, when the ninjas of the hand joined the fray, the Marvel Universe's familiar superhero versus supervillain formula reverted to its usual form. Think of it as a soulless Iron Man versus a horde of mutants, or the Avengers versus the Chitauri army. It was a clash of superpowers and high technology. The Hand, reduced to gang-peddling white flower on television, betrays its centuries-old legacy. In the comics, however, the Hand repeatedly displays the prestige expected of a major international organization with centuries of heritage. Jingzhen Yoshioka not only recruited numerous mutants from around the world and trained them from childhood as combat ninjas, but also discovered rituals to worship demon gods, granting his ninjas a touch of magic and their blessings. His own devotion to the primal demon beast imbued this old devil with a superhuman physique and numerous special abilities. Had it not been for Xiamen, supported by Lin Hao, Jingzhen Yoshioka wouldn't have suffered such heavy losses. In fact, his previous encounters with Xiamen had been more victories than defeats. Xiamen and the Chinese superhumans had to risk their lives every time they fought against a Hand. After all, the almighty Ancient One, leading Kamartaj, maintained a dreadful neutrality in this inter-ethnic war. After suffering a dozen casualties, over 100 Hand ninjas finally destroyed nearly 1,000 drones and 10 armors dispatched by Tony Stark. The majority of casualties came from the armors themselves, especially Friday's final self-destruct command to prevent the wreckage from leaking, which inflicted the heaviest casualties on the Han ninjas. Seeing the ninjas completely annihilate the aircraft and armor that had left them helpless, the Japanese soldiers on the front lines excitedly fled their trenches, venting their frustration at being chased and attacked. Great! Without these things, what can the Americans do to stop the mighty armies of the Empire of Japan? Go south, keep going south. Capture California, annex all of America. The Imperial Guards Division soldiers were generally of distinguished descent, at best from unbroken samurai families, hence their exceptional arrogance. Of course, facing the unmotivated American army, they had every right to be arrogant. Unfortunately, they probably overlooked the fact that drones and armored vehicles were merely industrial products, weaponry. As equipment, they could be mass-produced, like their guns. A single wave of drones and armor had already reduced the Han's ranks by nearly 10%. What if the enemy came in 10 times that number? On the battlefield, Jingzhen Yoshioka gazed at the charred bodies scattered about, his face dark and grim. These were the backbone he had carefully trained over the years. He'd lost dozens last time, and now he'd lost a dozen more. Even the largest family couldn't withstand such a defeat. Besides, this was only the first battle. Clean up the battlefield and gather the spoils. Jingzhen Yoshioka was no old-fashioned stubborn man. He believed in magic and supernatural powers, but he also valued technology, prioritizing practicality above all else. Therefore, he clearly understood the value of these drones and armor. He wasn't the only one who understood this. The Japanese commander on the front immediately dispatched a colonel with military police. Sir, Commander Itagaki requests that you immediately advance southward to clear the way for the army. As a token of good faith, I promise to grant you priority access to American banks and vaults. The colonel bowed politely, his upper and lower halves bent at almost right angles. The price he offered seemed generous, but compared to these cutting-edge technological achievements, money was nothing. Jingzhen Yoshioka simply glanced at him coldly, not bothering to respond. He was unqualified. Cold sweat broke out on the colonel's lowered head, yet he couldn't straighten up until the distinguished figure spoke. Otherwise, he'd deserve a reprimand, and it would bring shame on his family, who would think their children lacked manners. The Eastern Islands were a nation of distinct classes. The Han's ninjas ignored a squad of military police, picking up battlefield debris without a care in the world. The police wanted to lash out, but they didn't. The Imperial Guards Division's military police came from better backgrounds than the average soldier, often from long-established families. They'd heard of the power of ninja since childhood. Failure to complete this mission wouldn't be a big deal given their background, but if they acted now and irritated the ninja, a slap would be disgraceful and potentially fatal. Fortunately, the old devil, Jingzhen Yoshioka, was quite resourceful. To maintain his relationship with the Eastern High Command, he didn't take all the spoils for himself, instead picking up only the larger, more intact pieces of wreckage, avoiding the more insignificant shell fragments. After the ninjas cleared the battlefield, this generation of Blink opened another wormhole, but not to the Japanese forward base, but to Han's stronghold in Los Angeles. Jingzhen Yoshioka didn't dare go to San Francisco because of the large Chinese population there, and as a true Oriental, he feared self-destruction. This rule-based curse, capable of covering an entire ethnic group, disregarding distance and status, yet precisely targeting, might not even be achievable by the beasts he believed in. If self-destructed, the old Japanese worried that their own healing abilities would be insufficient. After the Hand cleared out the drones and armor, the Imperial Guard Division on the north bank of the Columbia River invaded south again, launching a fierce assault on Oregon. While the drones and armor bought the U.S. military some time, recruiting and reorganizing the army took time. New recruits needed at least 3 months of training to reach combat effectiveness, and where was the time now? There was already a pool of veterans within the U.S. who could be drafted in to help through this most dangerous period. However, ever since the tanks expelling wage-demanding veterans incident, these World War I veterans had become staunch anti-Confederates. Their inability to rebel was already a hindrance, so how could they be expected to protect those who ordered the tanks deployed? How despicable. Order all units, after defeating the U.S. regular army, do not stop. Actively seek out organized enemy forces and seize only U.S. government property. Do not loot U.S. civilians, lest we become embroiled in a turbulent security war. Itagaki Shiro, understanding American conditions, knew that civilians here, unlike those in China, possessed a gun. To protect their families and property, Americans would demonstrate a fighting spirit far exceeding that of regular troops. The Imperial Guards Division was small, and with the mainland Japanese army also recruiting and reorganizing, they were essentially racing against time. They had to rely on the high morale of the Imperial Guards Division to eliminate as many U.S. regular troops as possible before their offensive stagnation wore off, at least wiping out the U.S. forces along the western coast. As for the subsequent security battles, they were perfectly placed to be handed over to the newly formed army, allowing the recruits to complete their battlefield baptism with American blood. If it were another division, the order not to loot might not have been fully enforced, but the young master soldiers of the Imperial Guard Division had no shortage of money, let alone promotions and accolades. Oregon was quickly captured by the Imperial Guard Division, which also bypassed San Francisco, a potentially problematic area, and headed straight south to Los Angeles. Chapter 470, Open and Honest American Conscription. 1939, America entered a state of war prematurely. This time, however, they were completely unprepared. There was no need for their Pearl Harbor fishing techniques, as the Japanese fish not only took the bait but also washed up on the beach, leaving them defenseless. Recruiting posters were everywhere, and both the federal and state governments were using every trick in the book to coax young men into enlisting. Initially, movies and comics extolled the virtues of love for America. However, this time the battlefield wasn't across the Atlantic in Europe, but right in the West and even the Midwest, where the threat of war was palpable. Slogans like Love America were too empty, far less effective than tangible benefits. Consequently, the capitalists quickly shifted tactics, targeting young men's weaknesses. First, they doubled the previously established war allowances. Then, at great expense, they organized beautiful young women from across the country to parade on the streets, eagerly flirting with any muscular young men they saw. Anyone who could enlist and register them in the military would receive a lucrative commission. They were paid on a piecework basis, on the spot, with no defaults. This operation spurred those in specialized industries to respond, as the commission they earned from recruiting a single soldier was higher than the commission they earned from each individual sale. With all their earnings to themselves, no boss taking the lion's share, and unprecedented protection from the government and military, it was a dream work environment for American women. With these individuals acting as catfish, one can imagine how brazen their persuasive tactics were. Consequently, most young Americans felt timid upon entering the military camps. They were essentially dragged in. Faced with the Japanese invaders who had already invaded their territory, American capitalists invested heavily. They knew a little about the Japanese's behavior in China, and now that they had been driven out, they were in even greater need of reinforcements. It was easy to imagine what the Japanese would do to them. Meanwhile, failed art students were sparking a war in Europe, leaving American capitalists with nowhere to escape and no choice but to fight on. In such a critical moment, what was the value of saving face? Thus, American young men were blessed. The streets and alleys were filled with scantily clad women. These beautiful young women with voluptuous figures were even surrounded by men, each one eager for sex. Idiots, you're going to war. It'll cost you your lives. Someone with more sense couldn't help but intervene, only to find they were more sober than him. Let's go. If no one goes, we'll still be facing the Japanese invaders in a few months. Might as well have some fun now. Where do you normally get to see beauties like this? The shabby-clothed old man was speechless. Thinking back to his grumpy wife at home, and then looking at these beautiful women brimming with youthful energy, the old man was tempted. However, he was too old to lift any gun. By exploiting the young men's weaknesses, the American conscription finally proceeded smoothly. In fact, at this time, there was another conscription in America, but it wasn't for ordinary people. Instead, it specifically sought those with special abilities. This was, of course, Nick Fury's mutant recruitment, initiated at Phil Coulson's suggestion. This conscription didn't cause a rash of protests, but the price tag was high. Besides generous financial subsidies, it also promised everyone the ability to develop and enhance superpowers, and to enjoy futuristic healthcare for themselves and their families. The allure of money, the desire for power, and the bonds of family, the three-pronged approach was equally as effective, no less so than the open-minded beauty. In the New York suburbs, at the Xavier Manor, 10-year-old Charles Xavier stood in front of the radio, listening intently to the conscription announcement. Come on, you've been listening to this for 5 days straight. Aren't you tired? Raven, transformed into a normal little girl, lay on the sofa eating chips. I used to think we were the only special people in the world, but now it seems I was so superficial." The young Charles sighed, his expression pretentious. "So you want to go, right?" Raven, while lacking Charles's maturity, was by no means foolish. If Charles wasn't interested, why would he have listened for 5 days straight? Charles hesitated for a moment, then nodded solemnly. "I want to understand myself, to understand why we're different from ordinary people. Since these guys are making such a big fuss about gathering people like us, they must know a lot about us. After all, they're from the future." Charles had no interest in money. His parents were dead, and he had no family ties. But he had a strong thirst for knowledge, especially to understand why he was special. Unfortunately, his youth still filtered through his mind the future people, naively assuming that since they possessed more advanced technology, they would also have a deeper understanding of the world. Little did he know, they were from a completely different world. "If you want to go ahead. They can broadcast ads on the radio, so they must have government approval. They're not bad people." Clever Raven, naive with his age, didn't realize that while the White House wasn't entirely filled with bad people, it certainly wasn't full of good ones. Young Charles didn't understand this either, so after careful consideration, he asked his butler to prepare the car. "I'll have Armin take me there first." "You stay home." Charles' tone brooked no refusal. "No," Raven jumped up from the sofa. "Don't be ridiculous. I'll share the information I've learned with you." "You don't need to take any risks," Charles said seriously. Raven knew this was Charles's concern for her, but being alone and insecure, she naturally yearned for power. These days, not only had Charles been listening to the radio commercials, but she was too. So, she told him seriously, "I need to get stronger. Even if you don't agree, I'll act like an adult and go by myself." Charles had no choice but to agree to let her go. Butler Alman drove the two children to an industrial area in upstate New York, where Nick Fury had established SHIELD's new headquarters, distinct from the Avengers headquarters in Manhattan. After the appearance of Captain Black Skull, Nick Fury keenly sensed the subtle shifts in the Avengers' psychology, and their suspicions about Steve Rogers grew. The Elite Eagles disagreed with the other Tony Stark's judgment, or rather, were unwilling to agree. They preferred to believe that something was wrong with Steve's heart, leading to his dark turn. This kind of suspicion was fatal and could severely undermine team cohesion. Unless Steve was expelled and a new spiritual pillar found, the team would be doomed. Knowing there was no one to replace Steve, the extremely pragmatic Black Egg immediately abandoned the team he had assembled and invested so much effort in, devoting all his energy to the Super Soldier project. If the project succeeded, these superhumanly powerful androids would be more useful and more effective than the free-spirited Avengers. With a widespread use of recruitment ads, mutants like Charles, who had previously been hiding in American society, gradually gathered. Chapter 471, Interview between Professor and Mystique. With the help of automated construction robots, this industrial area in the northern suburbs of New York City was built at a breakneck speed, showcasing a sci-fi aesthetic 80 years ahead of its time. Young Charles and Raven entered the newly completed SHIELD building. Even Charles, from a wealthy family, was struck by the luxury decor, not to mention the impoverished Raven. This wasn't something wealth could ever achieve. They had money, but their technological limitations limited them to the technological advancements of their current era. Raven instinctively grasped Charles' hand, and Charles pursed his lips. Butler Armin, trying to act like a grown-up, still felt timid in front of the magnificent hall. This was clearly a spectacle orchestrated by Nick Fury, using cutting-edge technology to build a headquarters. Any modern mutant arriving would be immediately struck by SHIELD's legacy and instinctively yearn for it. It was like a shell company stubbornly renting a high-end office building to facilitate recruitment and to lure other companies into partnerships. And what's more, SHIELD, from 2023, truly possessed this legacy. The SHIELD agent in charge of reception spotted them and hurried over, politely asking, "Excuse me, who among you is the special one?" The man had found his way all the way to the SHIELD building from the outskirts of the industrial zone, clearly heading straight for it. Wealthy tourists these days would visit the specially built amusement parks, complete with amenities and recreational facilities, and wouldn't come to their place. Lately, SHIELD's visitors have mostly been mutants with superpowers or those who believe they possess them. After testing, The former are immediately relocated to residential complex, where they are well-fed for a few days before beginning their formal training. The latter, of course, are simply kicked out. Previously, S.H.I.E.L.D.'s mutants had mostly been adults, as it was difficult to convince parents of minors. Coupled with Americans' natural distrust of government and the ongoing war, parents worried that S.H.I.E.L.D. would immediately send their children off to war. The reception agent glanced at Charles and Raven, then cast a quizzical look at the butler, Armand. If this old man was a mutant, he could have come on his own. Why bring two little kids with him? Could it be that these two brats are the real culprits? The perceptive agent turned his gaze to Charles and Raven. Charles took a deep breath, pulling Raven forward and calmly answering, "We are all." The agent's eyes lit up, and his smile grew warmer. "Please follow me." He led the two children, one adult and two children, into the elevator, all the way to the top floor of the building, which had been converted into a dedicated testing facility. The reason it wasn't located underground was that they worried that mutants coming into contact with them for the first time might feel overwhelmed, or even suspect they were being held captive and subjected to nefarious experiments. If the Super Skrull's method of replicating superpowers wasn't simple contact, then Nick Fury certainly wouldn't mind conducting a series of nefarious experiments. S.H.I.E.L.D. had conducted such experiments before. Having the mutants take the external observation elevator all the way to the top floor not only allowed them to see the surrounding advanced industrial complex, but also gave them a sense of importance, thus forming a positive first impression of S.H.I.E.L.D. Wow, so tall, so beautiful. As expected, young Raven immediately forgot her awkwardness and became lively again. Even Charles was curiously surveying the surrounding future city, gaining a preliminary understanding of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s background. The agent in charge of reception smiled knowingly. Regardless of whether these two youngsters were mutants or not, they would never forget their experience. With their spontaneous promotion, modern Americans would unconsciously yearn for the lives of future people, which would be extremely beneficial for their future leadership and even control of modern America. While the two eras of America currently maintain a friendly and cooperative relationship, there must always be a distinction between superiority and inferiority, and between primary and secondary. The elite Eagles from 2023, with their small number and lack of popular support, are inevitably at a disadvantage in this cooperation. This is an unavoidable situation. However, they are confident that they can gradually corrupt modern Americans through the material comforts brought by technology, completely win them over, and subtly seize power. The elevator soon reached the top floor. "Sir, two more children are here." The receptionist led Charles and the others to Dimitri. Dimitri was also a close confidant of Nick Fury, having appeared in Spider-Man: Far From Home. He was a die-hard fan who remained loyal to the black-boiled egg even after 5 years of destruction. Dimitri had a Slavic-style face and a sharp gaze. Under his gaze, Raven retreated behind Charles. "Come with me. Show me your superpowers first." Seeing Charles frown slightly, Dimitri explained, "After the advertisement was released, many unreasonable people came here, so we need to show you your special abilities first. I need to follow the young master." Butler Armin finally acted like an adult. "Whatever," Dimitri said unconcernedly. He led the three to a room near the wall. There was a lot of equipment inside, and even targets were placed against the wall. Some of the targets had been burned because they had not been cleaned in time, and the wall was also scarred. Apparently, many mutants had demonstrated their abilities in this room over the past few days. "Don't worry, the walls are reinforced and aren't load-bearing. Even if you shatter them, it won't endanger the building." Dimitri gestured to the scarred wall and forced a rare smile. "If you can actually destroy it, I'd be delighted. Sorry, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed. Our abilities aren't offensive." Dimitri suddenly heard these words, and with a look of disappointment on his face, he replied, "Okay, show me." Charles glanced at Raven, who instantly transformed into Dimitri's form, identical in stature and appearance. Dimitri's eyes lit up, and he truly smiled. "Excellent." He turned his gaze to Charles, but he saw he hadn't spoken, yet he had heard his voice. "I've already demonstrated my abilities." Dimitri immediately covered his head, looking at Charles with horror, even though he was just a 10-year-old. "You can influence my memory, maybe more than that." Charles continued to increase the power, controlling Dimitri's behavior by influencing his consciousness. Although young Charles was mature beyond his years, he was still just a child and had a temper. Dimitri's undisguised disappointment had made Charles, who had always been considered the other people's child since childhood, a little unhappy. Chapter 472, Black Braze Dig. Boss, you should come over. A very special mutant arrived today. Maria Hill, who remained inside SHIELD headquarters, immediately video called Nick Fury after receiving Dimitri's report. His abilities are terrifying. Seeing Maria Hill's excited yet nervous expression on the screen, Nick Fury instantly took her seriously. He had never seen such a loss of composure from this level 9 SHIELD agent. I'll be right there. Nick Fury wasn't far away, in the factory area next to the headquarters. The journey took about 10 minutes, 10 of which was spent going up and down the elevator. Boss, I suggest you dress up a bit. He's still a child. Maria Hill pointed at the single eye of Black Sauce Egg. Should I dress up as Santa Claus? Nick Fury rolled his eyes at her, dismissing the suggestion. Charles and Raven had been ushered into the reception room downstairs. Dimitri had provided them with toys made from futuristic technology and children's food. Raven was interested in both the food and the toys, while Charles was attempting to dismantle the toys to examine their inner workings. Nick Fury pushed open the door and entered. The two children jumped in surprise at the sight of a one-eyed man charging in aggressively. Raven immediately dropped her things and hid behind Charles, who, in turn, turned his attention from his toys to stare intently at Nick Fury. The old butler, Armand, rushed over to the young master and haughtily barked at Nick Fury. "Nigger, stay away from my young master." Nick Fury's expression instantly changed, the change so obvious this time that it was clear. Maria Hill quickly stepped forward from behind to smooth things over, saying, "This is our chief, Mr. Nick Fury, Mr." Armand sneered. When did that word ever apply to farm implements? September 22, 1862. From that day forward, we enjoy the same rights as white people, Nick Fury replied coldly. With his shrewdness, he naturally wouldn't argue with a servant. "Errand, stand down," Charles said, his face serious, as if he were the master of the house. "Very well, young master." Armand bowed and stepped back. Nick Fury carefully studied Charles and Raven, who was hiding behind him, before finally focusing his attention on the young boy. His instincts told him that this precocious brat was the real deal. Maria Hill, naturally discerning, immediately introduced them. "Boss, this Mr. Xavier is a special talent with telekinetic powers. Miss Raven behind him has the ability to transform at will." "Hello." Nick Fury forced a rare smile, but then frowned. "It would be better if you didn't just browse through my memories." Charles stared in astonishment. This was the first person he had encountered who could detect his memory browsing. Previously, he had been able to do so silently. It was only fair to say that the young professor's abilities were still limited. His previous peeks had mostly been on ordinary people, with the equally young Raven being the only exception. It wasn't surprising that he would be noticed by the professionally trained king of agents. Once Apocalypse enlightened him, and the bald professor achieved his ultimate evolution, Nick Fury might not be able to detect him. Only his close friend, King of Iron, who had been repeatedly intruded upon, would be able to detect Charles's entry by following his familiar sense. "Sorry, it was just a reflex." Charles quickly devised a good excuse. Nick Fury, though displeased, was deeply moved by the young man's abilities, and he forced himself into what he considered a genial smile. "Mr. Charles, would you like to join SHIELD? SHIELD? Charles was puzzled. "Sorry, I've never heard of it. It hasn't been established yet. Historically, it wouldn't be officially established until several years later. The full name is the Strategic Homeland Defense Attack and Logistics Agency." Nick Fury recited the tongue-twisting name he hadn't used in a while. SHIELD had been infiltrated by Hydra, forcing him to make drastic changes, going from the open to the covert. Now, in another universe, he could finally bring the organization, which had cost him half his life's work, back to the light of day. Sounds like a military agency involved in homeland security. Charles, though young, knew a lot. Of course, SHIELD's purpose is to be a strong shield for America. For example, right now, the West is being invaded by the Japanese invaders, and we should do our part to fight the invaders. Nick Fury began to speak in a high-sounding tone, morally blackmailing Charles. "I believe all elites with a strong American heart wouldn't refuse to contribute to their country and become heroes who save it. An ordinary 10-year-old wouldn't understand the significance of national security, but Charles, with his mature age, mentally resembled a 15 or 16-year-old. Saving the country and becoming a hero were precisely what a middle school student longed for. However, The cautious Charles hesitated to express his opinion too quickly. Instead, he calmly inquired, "Your ad says you can help us develop our abilities. Do you know much about these things?" Charles thought he'd disguised himself well, but his immature performance made him look invisible to the old fox, Nick Fury. Seeing the kid's interest, Nick Fury doubled down. "Of course, there's actually a general term for special talents like you, mutants. You're not sick, nor have you undergone any mutations. You've simply awakened a unique part of your inherited genes." Before Charles could react, Raven leaped out from behind him, eager to demand, "Really? I'm not sick, and I'm not a monster, am I?" Raven, bullied since childhood for her unusual appearance, was desperate for recognition. A mutant like Charles, who appears normal but possesses powerful superpowers, could never truly understand the pain of mutants like Mystic and Beast, even if he could access their memories or even replace their consciousness. "Raven," Charles hesitated. The old fox, shrewd as he was, instantly understood Raven's mindset and blurted out, "Of course, you are humans with special talents. Not only are you not monsters, you are actually quite exceptional." The words he used to tell a child were full of foul language. "Did you hear that?" Raven said excitedly, grabbing Charles' hand. "I'm not a monster, I'm human too." Then, she turned to Nick Fury. "I'd like to join you." Charles had no choice but to accept. "Welcome to SHIELD. As a perk for new hires, we'll give you a comprehensive physical exam. You'll enjoy medical care that's 80 years ahead of current technology." Maria Hill stepped forward eagerly. Nick Fury smiled and nodded at her. Today, both of the little ghosts possessed impressive superpowers. Their perfect transformation abilities were a true feat for a secret agent, as were their mind-altering and memory-reviewing abilities. They also possessed a certain level of combat power, making them ideal for transplantation into super soldiers. Of course, Nick Fury didn't need to be as brutal as William Stryker. He could simply allow Gia's clones to touch these mutants. After receiving the two special mutants, Nick Fury returned to the biological laboratory, where a fully formed clone lay within the incubator. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 473, The Worst Outcome. Although I don't have a degree in biology, anyone with a modicum of common sense knows that this catalyzed embryo has no chance of growing into normal human. Inside the lab, Pim Hank sneered at Nick Fury. "Why normal?" Nick Fury retorted. Pim Hank suddenly realized something, and the sneer in his face intensified. "You're treating a clone of your old friend's daughter like this. Aren't you afraid Talos will take the Skrulls away from Earth?" Nick Fury didn't answer, but he sneered inwardly. Where can he go after leaving Earth? Where would he dare go? The war between the Skrulls and the Kree raged for years. 80 years is a sea change for Earth, but a blink of an eye for the two great interstellar civilizations. By 1939, the Skrulls were already crumbling. Even if they fled into space, they would be annihilated by the Kree. Nick Fury, who had known Talos for many years, had long seen through the cowardice in the alien's character. This guy's abilities are average, with no fortitude to face adversity or the courage to fight to the death. He might be a decent leader in peacetime, but choosing him when civilization's survival is at stake is a fool's errand. He's courting death. If Talos hadn't been so cowardly, how could Nick Fury have fooled him for 20 or 30 years? Even if Talos knew his daughter's clone had been deliberately made idiotic, Nick Fury would have 100 ways to appease his wrath. Simply by changing the clone's face, Talos would convince himself that it had nothing to do with his daughter. What's the big deal? Rather than explaining to Talos, Nick Fury was more concerned about whether the clone could inherit Gaia's special abilities. "Can you awaken it now?" Nick Fury deliberately used the word "it" to completely weaken a clone's human nature. "As long as you don't mind the loss of resources, you can always breed it again." Pim Hank knew the situation was critical. Since Nick Fury didn't care about speeding up, just wanting an obedient clone without self-awareness, why should he care? His implication was clear: even if this clone failed, they could just start over. With the experience gained from the first attempt, subsequent clones would be faster, and the scale of cloning could be expanded. Let's get started, then. We have no shortage of resources, only time. After receiving authorization, Pim Hank called in a group of biologists to begin the process of awakening the clones. They used alien biotechnology provided by the Skrulls. Cloning, and even artificial humans, were already well-established technologies among the once dominant civilizations. These Earth biologists only needed to digest them. After a while, the nutrient solution in the incubator was drained, and the clone inside slowly opened its eyes. This clone bore a striking resemblance to Dragon Mother, and, like the scene of her after her death in flames, it was a truly captivating sight. However, the white-coated and black-brined people present had already witnessed her growth from childhood, so the novelty was lost. The Dragon Mother-like Ayla clone crawled to its feet, taking several minutes to learn to walk, but within minutes, it was hopping and running. We've directly implanted some common sense and combat techniques into its mind, and we've also assigned Super Soldier 1 permissions, with you being the highest authority, a bespectacled man in a white coat reported to Nick Fury. Nick Fury had previously persuaded the consortium boss from 2023 to reclaim control of his small group. While the other consortium bosses were reluctant to accept Black's leadership, they lacked the power to do so and could only tolerate it for the time being. They pinned their hopes on 1939 America, attempting to regain control of their vast power and win over some of the Avengers to challenge Nick Fury. Gaia's clone approached Nick Fury and said numbly, "Director." Without delay, Nick Fury immediately took her to the mutant training base. "Everyone, come here. I found a new instructor for you." Nick Fury smiled warmly at the mutants in training. "This is," in the blink of an eye, he named the clone, Instructor Nia. "Everyone, shake hands with Instructor Nia first, get to know her." Black Egg grinned like a fox that had stolen a chick. Several mutants, unsuspecting, stepped forward to shake the clone's hand. After a few pleasantries, Nick Fury smiled again and said, "You guys go train first. I'll take Instructor Nia to get acquainted with the area." The mutant agents didn't notice anything unusual, as the two men continued to chat enthusiastically about the instructor's figure and touch. "Amazing. Instructor Nia's hands are so smooth. Even smoother than a milk bath. Wow, there's a subtle fragrance. Her face is so soft, and her breasts are so big. I'm so excited." The quality of these newly recruited mutants was mixed. Some were originally street thugs, illiterate and unable to even spell their own names. Nick Fury, however, didn't care about the quality of these guys. In his eyes, they were just a source material. If it weren't for the powerful Super Skrull's special abilities, these idiots would have long been lying on the operating table as experimental specimens. Leading the clone to another fully sealed base, Nick Fury eagerly asked, "Have you learned their abilities?" Without a word, the clone spat a mouthful of thick phlegm at a target on the wall. The phlegm was incredibly corrosive, instantly eating a large hole in the metal target. Then, she raised her hand and swung out a crimson whip of light. The whip danced, leaving distinct scorch marks on the ground. Did it work? Nick Fury was stunned for a moment, then burst into ecstasy. "Ho ha ho ha, I did it." This scene was witnessed by Lin Hao, who was far away in China. He frowned. "What the hell? He succeeded, why didn't I?" After learning of Black Salted Egg's Super Soldier project, he had openly come over to take some of Giant Aya's blood and clone himself. But no matter how he tried, all he ended up with was a living, breathing Dragon Mother figurine, worthless beyond mere play. Shouldn't it be possible to use the power of time, and instead directly catalyze the process with drugs? Lin Hao was puzzled. Just as he was wondering, Yang Jian suddenly called out, "Something's wrong. The laws of nature are disrupted. Can you explain it more clearly?" Lin Hao demanded. "I've only just started this course on deducing the laws of nature. To put it in terms you can understand, the rules of this universe have completely changed," Yang Jian explained. "They've become completely chaotic and untraceable." Lin Hao was stunned for a moment, then immediately picked up a glass from a nearby lab table. He let go, and the glass fell to the ground, shattering. Yang Jian seemed to see him, his eyes rolling in Lin Hao's mind. He continued, "It's not these basic physical rules, but the causal relationships between people, or the laws of social science, I still don't understand. Can you be more concise?" Lin Hao asked, bewildered. "Whether something succeeds or fails depends not only on objective rules but also on probability and error. I suspect that no matter what we do in this universe, we'll only see the worst possible outcome. But Americans will directly achieve the best possible outcome." It wasn't concise, but it was straightforward. "Is it eternity, or editing?" Lin Hao frowned. Chapter 474, Marvel and the Spirits. In the normal universe, No one knows whether the time rules of higher dimensional worlds are the same as those of lower dimensional worlds, or what the laws of the two are. However, in the Marvel Universe, time flows linearly forward, like the flow of a river. The past is irreversible, while the future has different branches. This is the law of time as explained by Bruce Banner in Avengers Endgame. The past you change is not your past, but your future. The past you change is not the past of this universe, but the past of other parallel universes. This linear forward rule not only affects the Marvel multiverse, but also the real world that created these universes. The real world is higher in dimension than the multiverse, but its time rules are still simple forward, but the speed of time flows differently and there is no fixed ratio. Sometimes a month passes in the real world, while years, even decades or centuries, pass in another universe. Sometimes, countless years pass from the creation to the destruction of a universe, while in the real world, only a moment passes, a single thought. Permission dogs are so capricious. Lin Hao saw, from Arnim Zola's memories, the spirit appearing to search for the editor, then staking out the zombie universe, and then sending the wasp, carrying the zombie virus, into the main movie universe. Including the subsequent actions, almost a year has passed. However, in the real world, less than 2 weeks have passed, 10 of which the editors were busy finalizing the new comic for publication. During these 2 weeks, Marvel Studios president Kevin Feige and editorial editor-in-chief Jonathan Hickman were filled with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. They hoped for a positive response from Eternity upon receiving the news, yet also worried that their plans would be thwarted. They feared that Eternity would become self-aware and refuse to come, granting them immortality and powerful superpowers. They were even more afraid that Eternity would endanger their safety and, like Deadpool had done before, kill a group of editors. With so much on their minds, it was clear they couldn't sleep well. Has Eternity gotten the news? Kevin Feige frowned, dark circles under his eyes. Have changes occurred in the zombie universe? This is so frustrating. Jonathan Hickman was even more haggard than his boss, for whenever his boss spoke, he was the one who did everything. Boss, will Deadpool be in trouble? According to our design for Eternity, Eternity will be able to detect Deadpool as soon as he appears within the multiverse. To achieve immortality and extraordinary powers, Kevin Feige had been intensively studying all the versions of Eternity that editors had previously proposed, even retrieving and reviewing all the original comics where Eternity had appeared. I still think Deadpool alone isn't a reliable channel for information. How about I become Captain Universe again? Jonathan Hickman's eyes gleamed. If the editor's pen alone could create a world and alter the multiverse, Jonathan Hickman would have already reintroduced himself into the story and personally courted Eternity. However, to complete the creation process, the work had to be published, and publishing a single volume required obtaining a publication number. This step required applying to the government, and the application required a Marvel company seal. In the past, this was a breeze. Kevin Feige wouldn't have bothered, simply going through the process and requesting the seal from the administrative department. But now, knowing the truth, Kevin Feige has decreed that all comics and scripts involving the content must not use the seal without his approval. He even confiscated all the company's seals, forcing administrative directors to go to his office whenever they needed them. This prevented Jonathan Hickman from secretly entering the multiverse. He wasn't foolish enough to inform on the matter. After all, 2 people achieving immortality was better than a whole bunch of powerful people achieving immortality. As for how Jonathan Hickman knew that comics alone couldn't enter the multiverse, it was, of course, because he had tried countless times in recent days. Kevin Feige, upon hearing his subordinate's words, immediately became alert. He turned back to Jonathan Hickman, his gaze dark. Until we master superpowers, having another character freely entering and exiting our world is an added danger. As a boss, Kevin Feige was clearly quite shrewd. He didn't confront his subordinate, who had been harboring ulterior motives, but he quickly reacted. This guy must have tried to create new comics, but it clearly wasn't successful. This shows that truly changing the multiverse requires publishing. Confirming this, Kevin Feige breathed a sigh of relief and made a secret resolution. You must take the company seal with you from now on, even sleep with it. The 2 men scheming had Lin Xian, who had already been in the real world for 2 weeks, growing worried. Why hasn't Wade returned yet? It hadn't taken much time to cross that sea of pink bubbles. While the speed of time was different and comparison impossible, it shouldn't have taken that long without any news. Is there something wrong with Wade? Lin Xian, upon arriving in the real world, had lost all his divine attributes, remaining only with the supernatural powers inherent in his body. Otherwise, with the divine authority he represented, he could easily understand all the mysteries of the universe with a single epiphany. Disguised as a relatively uncommon redhead, Lin Hao was touring China in the real world, specifically visiting its renowned mountains and rivers to learn about the country's Buddhist and Taoist culture. Though devoid of divine attributes, the bodies possessed by the children of eternity were naturally top-notch, with high intelligence, a sharp mind, and an astonishing memory. In just a few days, she had mastered Chinese and was even learning various dialects, so she could consult the Taoist and Buddhist monks in Taoist and Buddhist temples. Faced with such a studious and voluptuous exotic beauty, both monks and Taoists would readily teach her everything. After paying tuition, they would even pass on their secret cultivation techniques. After all, cultivating immortality was not possible in this world. Lin Hao wasn't sure if these so-called cultivation techniques were useful, so she simply memorized them. In pursuit of immortality, Kevin Feige earmarked a portion of the company's public relations budget for Lin Hao's travel expenses, enough for her to obtain not-so-secret information from various sects. Lin Hao also used money and her beauty to pave the way, having people investigate Lin Hao. Unfortunately, they only found numerous people with the same name, not even those who looked like him. Of course, she didn't know that Lin Hao had already searched for him the last time he returned, and that this real world didn't have a Lin Hao, not even the one he once was. Without Wade Wilson's help, Lin Hao couldn't enter or exit the real world, nor could she gain information about the multiverse. She could only wait. She also hoped that Marvel's editors would grant free access to a few more characters, but Kevin Feige flatly refused every time she made the request. Lin Hao knew his concerns, and further requests would only annoy them and achieve nothing. Even if she tipped off the Disney bosses, they wouldn't agree to increase the number of people allowed in and out of the real world, nor would they control the scope of their knowledge. Kevin Feige's current request was simply immortality, a simple one for her father. If more people knew about this, who knew if someone would make unreasonable demands? Most crucially, what if someone tried to destroy her father? Faced with an editor possessing the power of creation, Lin Hao was hesitant to act rashly. The situation remained stagnant. Chapter 475, The Waiting Henchman and Three Ambitious People. Having lost her divine authority, the spirit possessed no psychic abilities like telepathy, so she was unable to detect Arnim Zola lurking within the network. Marvel's executives were even less able to detect the electronic lifeforms constantly monitoring them. By reviewing Arnim Zola's memories, Lin Hao confirmed that the editors had made no new moves. The one who altered the rules of the universe in 1939 was most likely Eternity, though other powerful gods could be supporting America. Faced with this new situation, Director Lin opted for a cautious approach, sending his henchmen and tools to test the waters. With a wave of his hand, he opened a translucent portal to the base universe. A moment later, two henchmen appeared before it. Like an arrow piercing the clouds, the two, less powerful than an army, appeared before Lin Hao. "Boss, you finally remembered me," a tearful Indian boy, Ericum, exclaimed, his expression a mixture of emotion and resentment. He was ordered to establish the Indian Republic in Washington and Oregon in the base universe. Now the ruler of a nation, he ruled a small population, just over 1 million. Without the zombie army, he wouldn't have even had the capital to establish a state. "Not bad, you've learned a bit of the hypocrisy of politicians," Lin Hao said with a smile. Ericum immediately toned down his exaggeration and smirked. "Boss, being king is really not easy. Even though there are only over 1 million people, there's so much trouble." To please the boss, his minions diligently studied Chinese and diligently understood Chinese culture. "If you don't want to be king, I can find someone else," Lin Hao said lightly, yet with immense force. Ericum, however, displayed his fierce will to survive and all his cleverness, his face alight with anticipation, his eyes alight with surprise. "Really? I just want to be by your side, boss, even if it means running errands." Lin Qianhu, standing beside him, rolled her eyes and turned away with a look of disdain. After the independence of the Ryukyu Islands in the base universe, Chi Aragaki and the villagers of Kyum village have reverted to their ancestral surnames, returning to Han Chinese ethnicity. Lin Chi now realizes that her true boss isn't the so-called nine-tailed fox, but the man before her, perhaps a descendant of the same clan from 800 years ago. In her 30s, she not only looks like a ripe peach but also possesses a mature mind. Having witnessed the might of the Divine Spear Bureau and Lin Hao,
She understands that Ryukyu's future depends on standing firmly on the side of China. Lin Hao doesn't care about his minions' ulterior motives. They've all signed the contract voluntarily, and nothing can be hidden from him. It's still the same job. One's in charge of the Japanese, the other's in charge of the Indians. This universe could be dangerous, so be careful. Don't worry, even if my boss dies, he can still save me. Ericum quickly expressed his loyalty. While his minions explored the route, Lin Hao remained in the northwest. With the aid, this yellow land was undergoing a transformation, becoming a modern city at a visible pace. The Japanese invaders were completely wiped out, the hatred of his compatriots vented, and enthusiasm for construction surged to an unprecedented level. However, the nature of preserved fruits is hard to change. One after another, the receiving officials rushed out from the southwest, staging a Five Sons marrying drama in the once occupied land. In times of national crisis, these gentry and nobles fled faster than rabbits, and now, seeing the benefits, they pounced back with the speed of hungry wolves. A war of unspeakable and unspoken is brewing. Director Lin, the people in the southwest want to speak with you, said the white-bearded Yu Yi, rushing to deliver a message to Lin Hao. With such a commotion in the Loess Plateau, and a celestial palace floating over the Bohe Sea, Lin Hao hadn't avoided Zhao Jiao and the nearby villagers. If he couldn't get even this little bit of information, Boss Dai and Bossu would be in trouble. I'm not surprised they know about me. I'm more surprised how they got to know you. Lin Hao regarded Yu Yu with interest. You should know that I have a future apprentice named Wang. In fact, their family has been in Kamartaj since the late Qin dynasty. The one who approached me is Wang's father, Gu Yi explained in detail. Did he participate in the war against the Hand? Lin Hao asked. No, Ancient One smiled bitterly and shook his head. Then let him die. Lin Hao's eyes were tinged with coldness. Also, don't mistake your position again. Will you be unaware of my choice? All right, Ancient One said with a wry smile. I'll do it myself. This disciple surnamed Wang had begged him for days, begging him to the heavens and the earth. Only reluctantly did Ancient One agree to help pass on a message. Having seen the future, how could he not know the direction of history? It was only out of the bond between master and disciple that he came to deliver the message. The outcome was predictable. Watching him depart, Lin Hao chuckled, as expected of an old fox who has lived for centuries, so cunning. Ancient One knew Lin Hao's choice. He had resorted to this act simply to use this disciple's life to reaffirm his stance to the outside world and to Lin Hao. After all, they had once been equal allies. Now, they had signed a contract, their life and death controlled by Lin Hao. The weak might not care, but how could the strong not have a temper? But the Ancient One dared not refuse. Having witnessed the capriciousness of Marvel's editors, he realized that even his boss, Eternity, couldn't save him. To survive, the Ancient One had no choice but to sign the devil's contract. Lin Hao didn't care about the bald transport captain's thoughts. The wheel of history would eventually roll forward, and with his help, it would only roll faster and more powerfully. Across the ocean, Nick Fury, overjoyed at the success of the Super Soldier project, immediately ordered an expansion of the cloning program and intensified the recruitment of mutants, extending beyond America to the world. However, in this universe populated by mutants, SHIELD wasn't the only force with some knowledge of mutants. Compared to these time-honored organizations, SHIELD, an outsider, was a mere junior. Seeing America's aggressive recruitment drive, other mutant groups scattered across the world took action, some even using state-sponsored channels to recruit mutants. As the instigator of the war, Sandeezy increased his investment in the Strategic Scientific Corps. Despite Abraham Erkins's defection to America, the Strategic Scientific Corps suffered little impact. After all, he was merely a researcher, with day-to-day management being handled by Johann Red Skull Schmidt. Furthermore, within this universe populated by mutants and inhumans, the Strategic Scientific Corps also harbored the Dark Emperor and Maximus, each vying to exploit the futuristic technology of the Führer. Realizing that ordinary soldiers were no match for the Americans, he placed high hopes on this extraordinary force, providing both personnel and funds. This undoubtedly facilitated the actions of the three ambitious individuals. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.